the CentreSteer podcast, a podcast by, for, and about Land Rover owners.
Welcome to the CentreSteer podcast, podcast number 136 for July of 2024. CentreSteer is a monthly podcast for Land Rover enthusiasts, hobbyists, and owners around the world. This month, we commemorate the day when U.S. Customs seized classic Defenders suspected of being imported illegally. Will Hedrick tells us the full story of how he became the Defender of Defenders. Trademarked. He has trademarked that. This is a long discussion. Thankfully, the news is relatively short. That's coming up. I'm John Costage, and joining me and my fellow owners and enthusiasts, Harold Morgan, and Dixon is back. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good day.
Dixon's on the ground for a change.
Do you have to get your land legs back after spending that much time in the air? It is interesting. You do notice it after long flights of many hours, that the differences and such.
Walk like a penguin for a bit after you get off, don't you?
Crossing the Atlantic, you were a penguin. Outside air temperature was inside air temperature, and it wasn't warm.
Like a Land Rover.
So it's like driving a series truck. Yeah.
Ravis and Placid Lassie are only 8 years apart.
It's really a series aircraft.
It really is.
And stay tuned. We're going to get more detail from Dixon on his Placid Lassie commemorative of the D-Day landings coming up in a bit. But thanks to our Patreon and Buy Me a Tea subscribers for their support. Patreon supporters receive bonus content, including 10 questions, our Land Rover-oriented question and answer lightning round. We'll have one from Will posted later in August. Our latest Buy Me a Tea is from Bob Steele. Bob says, what a special treat to get to know Doug Mays. He was kind to join us at the PNW rally in Redmond, Oregon in May. All of us Land Rover enthusiasts on hand are grateful to Doug for taking time to discuss his Camel Trophy experiences, recovery skills, and share his diabolical side. Who can forget the physical challenges of the Anarch Cup competition that he was doing? Thank you, Doug, and thank you, CentreSteer, for bringing these Land Rover legends to us monthly. Brown Waters for Harold, John, and Doug. Well done. Thanks, Bob.
Oh, Morgan and Dixon are getting left out of the brown water here, or what? Come on, Bob. You can't bring enough for everybody.
Maybe he'll provide that to you in person at the North Star rally.
Oh, looking forward to it.
Speaking of a rally, let's talk about the North American events calendar. Dixon's back. What's going on in Rover world?
For August, there really isn't that much. There's 3 things of note. If you're on the West Coast, on August 10th, there's the Santiago Stargaze being put on by the Southern California Rover Club. It's a kind of a night thing at the top of Santiago Peak to view the Perseid meteor showers and so on. They say bring a warm clothes, comfy chair, and some warming things, and they will be doing that. Look at the Anarch website for more information on that one. The second event is the 23rd to 25th of August, and it is the Ottawa Valley birthday party. That's going to be up by McDonald's Corners, Ontario. It's the 41st or 42nd annual event that's been up there for people that have been there in the past. It's only about 12 minutes north of Silver Lake where it was before. It's a weekend of some mud bogging and trails in the Lanark Highlands and so on. It's always can be rather entertaining. Again, with them, the OVLR website or Anarch websites for registration. And the third one is, and if I recall correctly from Bob, August 9th, they will be opening up registration for the Mid-Atlantic Rally. There is a limited number of places there. And so you're going to want to go and find out and be on that website to get a spot, because last year, and for the last couple of years, it sells out in usually a half hour or less. So you want to go and be ready to start clicking madly if you're actually interested in going to the Mid-Atlantic Rally.
Yeah, they
7 p.m. Eastern, as I understand it.
They purposely moved it back because of the North Star Rover Rally, because a lot of people were going to be at the Rover Rally, at the Minnesota Rally, and wanted to make sure that they got the opportunity.
Some of them were prepared with satellite link ups so that they could get it done, but Apparently they won't
Oh.
have to now.
Oh, the lag on a satellite connection will probably lose you your spot.
Yeah, quite possibly.
So if you really want to get driving right about now, as you're listening to this podcast as it's dropped, you want to be heading up to Minnesota, where the North Star Rally is happening. It is another rally that has about as long a pedigree as the OVLR birthday party. It's been around nearly 40 years too.
That's happening basically now. I'm sure some people will be listening as they're on their way, maybe even on their way back. But if you're not familiar with it, not going, go check out narcs.club, and there's a link to it. I suspect you could still attend. I know they're closing registration, I think, at the event, but I suspect they take people at the last minute.
I think you'd miss out on the Saturday dinner is probably the only thing, but I think you could probably show up and you'd at least get to be there and be part of the party. It's a good time. It's a good place, good people.
Indeed.
I would add that if you're listening and your club hasn't been mentioned, I would strongly recommend that you go to anarch.club and enter in the information on your event so it can be publicized to people that may be nearby that are looking for an event to go to. And as I acclimatized to being close to the sea level again, I actually missed one. The third annual Maine Misfits and Rover Bits rally that's happening on August 16th through the 18th. This one is down in Green, Maine, in that upper right-hand corner of the United States on the map. It is an interesting small event at Valorant's place. It's $20 per head to cover the cost of the event, porta potties, actually having running water and things like that. It's very much come and share with other people. There's 200 acres of trails, camping, campfires, and such, and tons of series parts and so on available if you're actually looking for stuff for your vehicle. So go look that up for the weekend of August 16th to 18th. And finally, if you're into planning way ahead, there is a third Anarch event. And as you probably noticed, they are located geographically around the United States. And the third one goes towards the southeast, the Gulf Coast Land Rover Club Rally, which will be down in Alabama. That's going to be on October 24th to the 27th.
It is in Robertsdale, Alabama, which is about halfway between Mobile, Alabama, and Pensacola, Florida, at the Grand River Motorsports. Apparently, there's several hundred acres of land there. There is no need to close it off just for us. And it has been renamed. It is now called, Harold, I don't think I haven't told you this yet. It is the Gulf Area Rover Romp. It's still the GAR, but it's the Rover Romp, not the Rover Rally.
As long as we can still say GAR,
Absolutely.
we're happy.
And I understand there is going to be a cool logo for the event, and it may include a pirate.
Ooh.
Yes.
Will they be putting that on a GAR badge and giving out the GAR badge bag with it?
Out.
And as you're listening to this, anticipate that the GAR registration will open in mid-August.
Ooh.
Yes. It'll be a week after MAR registration opens for a number of reasons. One, I'm on vacation. Charles is on vacation. Charles Bell is president of the Gulf Coast Land Rover Club, and he's out for a couple weeks on vacation. So he will, when he gets back, and then I get back, we will get all the details posted, and there will be a registration for that.
So they give you a week for your click finger to recover from the muscle strain of registering for MAR.
Exactly. Then you can register for GAR. That is the club events coming up here in North America for the next couple months. Thanks very much, Dixon.
Welcome.
You had an excused absence the last couple podcasts for D-Day 80th anniversary commemorations. You flew in Placid Lassie. Give us a little bit about what happened there. What was that like?
This year is the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings during the Second World War. This was a 48-day trip starting off in Oxford, Connecticut, jumping to Presque Isle, Maine, to Goose Bay, Labrador, to Reykjavik, Iceland, to Prestwick, Scotland, down to North Weald, England in the aircraft. And there we did a few air shows and dropped round parachutes on England for the first time in about 30 years, and then spent 10 days dropping out of Placidlassi herself about 1,000 paratroopers on Normandy in various places, along with other DC-3s or C-47s properly, and C-130s from the U.S. Air Force. After that, it was to a small museum south of Paris, which has a bunch of pre-war aircraft, mostly French, to Wiesbaden, Germany for the 75th anniversary of the Berlin airlift. We dropped paratroopers and candy on that one. One of the things for the Berlin airlift was the candy bomber, Colonel Halvorsen, who would drop candy out of his aircraft that turned into quite a production during the airlift. So one of the celebratory things every 5 years is to drop candy out of a DC-3, which is, let's say, an interesting experience.
Well, what do you mean interesting experience? What does that mean?
There's a lot of little parachutes to have to pack for each candy bar.
The Jelly Belly company actually has packed their Jelly Bellies with parachutes, and then they are handed to us in large plastic garbage cans. And you're standing at an open door of an aircraft, and when you're told to start dumping, you're supposed to pour all of these things out the door.
Wow.
When you're going about 90 to 100 knots, one, you don't pour them side by side because you have lots to go, because the person pouring upwind of you, a lot of theirs are going to be coming right at this in the face of the person in the spot as they fill the aircraft with these things. And if you try and pour from above, you have the chance of losing said garbage can as it bounces off the elevator down to the ground.
This is where
And
a
then-
C-130 with the tail ramp would come in handy, huh?
I don't know how they didn't drop any from C-130s. It all came out of the C-47s. It's always fun to watch behind because you've got thousands of kids along the runway. And you might think military police are big, strong, fast, and smart. Against several thousand kids, they don't have a hope.
Never get between a kid and his candy.
Oh, no. The runways and areas were just closed like ants crossing the grass as they burst through the lines.
How many planes participate in the commemorative of the airlift?
And this year, there were 7 or 8 that were there. In 2019, I think there was 25. It all varied. There's all sorts of reasons behind it and so on.
When you were coming over on the Atlantic, were you guys by yourself? Was that the only aircraft, or did you travel with other?
Oh, no,
aircraft?
there were 6 aircraft that were coming across, but you're all spaced out an hour or 2 apart. Placidlassi has original ferry tanks that we can be put in, so it can actually go from Labrador to Iceland. The other planes have to stop in Arshiquak, Greenland, which was actually one of the stops on the Blue Spruce route across during the war. They're all an hour apart. And actually, coming into Scotland, Placidlassi was the most watched airplane actually in the world, according to FlightAware.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool.
When we landed in Prestwick, despite it was pouring rain, as to be expected in Scotland, there were hundreds of plane spotters around taking pictures as all the aircraft came in.
Oh, excellent.
Quite interesting.
And how did the D-Day commemoration go? How did Placidlassi participate in that?
So if people watching the news on the 6th of June would have seen 4 C-47s and 4 fighters going over during this ceremony with Macron, Biden, Trudeau, Zelensky, and such, and King Charles that were all there. There's really no paradrops on D-Day itself. It all happens around it. And I think we were dropping upwards of paratroopers 6 times a day.
So on the day of, you're doing just a flyby, and it's a day before, day after is when you actually drop troops.
Yeah, that's about 10 days of dropping paratroops and so on. Oh, yes. Because if you're into jumping out of perfectly serviceable aircraft, you've got a bucket list that you work your way up. And the top of it is going to be out of an authentic vintage plane that was there at D-Day on the beaches and landing zones of Normandy.
I did not know this.
The top.
This is a thing. I did not know that.
Oh, it's certainly a thing.
There are things for every kind of fetish you could ever have.
Oh, yeah. There are people that have jumped out of these planes hundreds of times.
Okay. So you're doing this over a course of, say, 10 days. Are people then Are they paying to do this?
Oh,
then
yes,
jump on the
they-
plane? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, they're
lining up to buy tickets to get thrown out of a perfectly good airplane.
Okay.
They are, and there's actually two flavors of it. One is going over to Normandy, getting on the plane in Normandy and getting dropped at a drop zone. The more expensive one is you line up and start at an RAF base or former RAF aerodrome. You do the cross-channel trip and get dropped in Normandy.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Is there a super platinum option where you do all this while getting shot at?
No, but there is if you want to be on the leading edge of the annual invasion, there are French customs agents waiting down below to go and capture you rather than
Okay.
German troops shooting
Okay.
at you.
All right, it adds something to the experience.
Does.
Can you fly Placid Lassie from the U.S. all the way over?
If you're a volunteer and a member of the crew, you can actually do it with any of the aircraft, but obviously, for insurance and safety reasons, the average person, the answer is no. The challenge is that you can go from New York to London in about, 6 hours or something like that. This is about 20 to 30 hours in total with the stops. And the planes are so low that you're using this year's satellite phones to go and communicate, but you're just too low, too slow. And if anything goes wrong, you're ditching in a very cold North Atlantic. And you've got to get life raft out. You've got to be in Gumby suits, and you just can't you want the minimum number of people on the aircraft, which is the way they did it in the war too.
I think the liability for hypothermia might be too much.
There's certainly ice in the water below us, but
I think there's ice
a different
ice
discussion.
inside the aircraft, isn't there?
You were in your winter parka, and you were then in your winter sleeping bag, and that would keep you warm. Outside air temperature is inside air temperature.
And there's nothing positive about it, I'm assuming.
If you bring a large iPad, you can watch an in-flight movie, and the in-flight movie going over was Island of the Sky, which is actually a movie that's about a C-47 going down in northern Canada and then being stranded there for 80 days.
Wow.
Oh,
Well, there's a good movie to watch.
Inspires you with lots of confidence.
And our own Ben Smith is the pilot.
He was one of the pilots, yes.
Okay, there's multiple pilots.
And Eric Zipkin, when I was on the plane. So you have 3 Series 180-inch owners on the aircraft.
Nice.
Is that a requirement to be on the crew?
It may eventually be, but not right now. One of the mechanics is actually a very enthusiastic Jeep owner.
You must own something that leaks almost as much as a C-47.
As I think I've alluded to in the past, owning a C-47 makes us Series Land Rover owners look like rank amateurs when it comes to pouring out oil. They use kiddie pools under a C-47 half the time, and spare parts where you have pallet racking to fill the stuff up.
So tell us about what Land Rovers you saw in Europe.
I was actually shocked there were so few. In Iceland, I saw a single 110 and a D90. Scotland, I think, was 2 110s actually at the airport. In England, I saw 1 Series 3 and I think 2 90s and a 110. France was 1 Series 3, a bunch of 90s and 110s, and a pair of 130s and a high cap. So the French are doing better with Land Rovers than the British. None in northern Germany, and a single 110 camper in Bavaria. So on the way back, I did see a lightweight, a 110 pickup and a 110 hard cap in southern England, but very few. It was quite surprising there were so few.
It's so profitable to send them over here to the States where people pay way too much for them.
One thing there wasn't a shortage of was MBs and GPW Jeeps. Of course, we left all of ours over there after the war, but my God, I guess it's because it's D-Day, but they were everywhere and in immaculate shape. Very impressive.
That's a good sign, too, that they've kept them in good shape for historical purposes.
Oh, it was tempting not to take the springs to bring home to put on the 80-inch.
There you go.
The one thing that I missed was that in this whole theme of lack of Land Rovers, we went to the Sywell Air Show, quite impressive air show with, I think there was 9 or 11 Spitfires there, more than you ever see over here. We arrived in Placid Lassie, and of course, they have to tow the aircraft to where it's going to be displayed because you'd otherwise blow everything else away. There was not a single Land Rover around to tow the aircraft. They towed the plane into place using an Ineos Grenadier.
Oh, wow.
Marketing opportunity for Ineos and not one for JLR.
Wow.
They should have had a Defender there.
Yes, they should. Yes, they should.
As I've said before, I think the Ineos is the Defender that the Defender should have been.
Whole different conversation.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And also part of that conversation is Land Rover's not there anymore. They've moved on. That's not.
Oh, yes.
It's not in their marketing strategy these days.
To make it over to Gaydon, that's an impressive museum to go to for a Land Rover enthusiast for all the different things there.
Absolutely.
Which is probably the only Land Rover oriented thing we got to do the entire trip. It was just too busy.
How long were you away total?
48 days.
Whoa.
Holy leave of
Wow.
absence, man.
Oh, it made doing the Ottawa Valley newsletter very challenging.
Still got it done.
I imagine it would make getting paid a challenge too. That's a lot of time off from work.
COVID was very good to us because you were allowed to accumulate that vacation time that you didn't use. So I was just expending vacation time from 2020 and 2021 and such.
Wow.
That's impressive.
Thanks very much, Dixon, for the report on that and participating in the D-Day commemorations. It's very cool.
Thank you for your service.
Yes, and thank you for the photos that you sent while you were on the trip.
If you're interested in it, there is the Tunison Foundation has a newsletter, which obviously be no surprise to anyone. I do. That's loaded full of pictures. So if you go to the tunisonfoundation.org website and send an email, I'm sure they'll happily send you a copy of it.
Yeah, we'll definitely have a link in the show notes to that. And you can also follow the Instagram account for the Tunison Foundation, which is pretty cool.
And the website does have a full page for Placid Lassie with pictures and descriptions and gallons per mile of both fuel and oil. So well worth a look.
All right, it's time now for the news. So let's get to it. And first up is sales. JLR had a sales boost in their Q1 sales, and they're a little off on their fiscal year. So Tata owns JLR and has reported an increase in sales for the first quarter of the fiscal year 2025, which is to the end of June of 2024. It's just the way they do it.
Apparently, it's fiscal year 2025.
I'm glad you noticed that, Harold, as this article.
So it's a future projection.
Exactly, for the year 2000.
Thousands of years in the future.
20,000 years in the future. They reflected a substantial demand for its vehicles. Wholesale Q1 volume of 97,755 units. This excludes the Chery Jaguar China joint venture was up 5%. Retail sales grew 9%. Wholesale of the Range Rover Sport models increased 22% and 46% respectively. And the overall mix of the most profitable Range Rover Sport and Defender models increased 68% to total wholesale volumes as part of the company's focus on its reimagination strategy. And compared to the prior year, retail sales volume in the quarter were up 43% in North America, up 14% in the UK, and 4% in Europe. They do not mention about any backlog and what the backlog is on orders. So things continue to be good.
They've stopped keeping track of how far behind they are?
Don't know.
Or not reporting it.
Just not reporting it.
Not admitting it. Okay.
My uninformed observation is that JLR sales are it's like a drug addict. They're high one quarter, crashing another. I know they want to be at the high end of the marketplace, but that's fickle with the economy. If the economy is doing well, their sales are really doing well. But you need volume to sustain the cash flow. The yo-yoing in their finances are quite impressive. They've divorced their trades and utilitarian roots. I wonder how they can keep all this up in the air.
That's, I think, part of that reimagination strategy. They've moved up scale.
Which makes you much more susceptible to swings in the economy.
And they're coming out with special versions all the time to keep it interesting and different.
Yeah, but a lot of the other luxury brands are tied with larger corporations that also have more utilitarian vehicles there to sustain things.
We know what happened when they tried to go mainstream and become a large producer. That didn't work either.
That's one thing going to try and be their million car a year producer. It's another completely different thing of being smaller scale and having a balanced out. Just the old-fashioned economist in me.
No, I don't think you're wrong. It's just commenting on what the perception of their strategy is all
no.
I'm doing.
Overall, they're making money and they're doing well and they're still around, which is a good thing.
For now.
In addition, the seasonality of it too, that clearly there's a seasonality with separate from the economy side where people are like, oh, I really want a Land Rover for summer, or I really want one for winter. And it just cuts down the rest of the year.
Let's move on to JLR settles infotainment lawsuit. Owners get fixes. Lawyers get big bucks.
Get paid no matter what.
The ratio on this one is especially impressive, though.
Yeah.
Well,
so much for the 25% contingency fee.
JLR has denied claims from a class action lawsuit alleging defects with its In Control Touch Pro and In Control Touch Pro Duo infotainment displays, but the car maker has reached a settlement. And of note, the InTouch Pro was what they used to call their infotainment. Now it's Pivi Pro. This kind of lines up with them changing the name. A lawsuit filed against the manufacturer asserts that certain vehicles have problems related to the radio, smartphone integration, heating and air conditioning. They also said to suffer from problems related to the rear view camera displays and navigation systems. There's a list of all the vehicles it includes. It's pretty much all Jaguars and all Land Rovers from 2016, 2017 up until 2020. And 2020, I think, is the last model year of that In Control system. The class action filed against JLR asserts that the company had been unable to resolve the problems and has not introduced effective software updates. Interestingly, buyers and lessees of impacted vehicles won't be financially compensated through the settlement. Instead, JLR will issue a field service action. Certain vehicles will receive an over-the-air update, while older models that don't support over-the-air updates will be retrofitted with a newer system that does offer support, the over-the-air update support. Owners of vehicles with older systems will have 1 year from the date of the settlement to get their vehicles corrected. JLR will also extend the warranty of the infotainment master controller up to a year. Here's the line. 3 plaintiffs who filed the lawsuit will each receive $5,000. The lawyers representing them are also seeking, they haven't gotten it yet, but they're seeking $795,000.
And I'm guessing that they don't have thousands of lawyers that worked on this case.
I'm sure there were more than one, but certainly less than 10,000 or something.
Yeah.
Not that I'm an Android or Apple fanboy, but I'm continually amazed that companies like Jaguar or Ford or something think that they're software companies and want to develop all of their own in-house infotainment systems, when really go to a software company and let them do it for you. I just license it. It's surprising that they want to own it all.
Seems like it would be cheaper just to buy it and put it in.
Some are now with CarPlay and whatever the Android one is called. They are starting to go that way, but I'm still surprised that companies like Land Rover and so on, and it's true in the camera industry and lots of other places, that really farm the business out to someone that knows what they're doing and are used to dealing with I forget what they call it, how the interface works with people.
From what I'm hearing in that part of the industry, it's what has come from the software industry, where they want to generate constant income and therefore go to a subscription service. So the car companies have been sold that if you want to make more money consistently, you need to have a subscription service. And part of that subscription service is selling the information that they have on your driving habits and what you're listening to and how long you have the AC on, all that kind of information, and sell it. So they make another income stream.
Oh, yes.
So that's all part of that. The car company, especially Ford in particular, I've noted, has tried to partner with Microsoft and come up with a system to run it. But then they backed out of that, I think because of that reason, where they're trying to be told, you need to make more income. Cars are a known quantity, and how much you're going to make on it, you can make this relatively cheap and easy way of making another income stream. I don't think it's a car company's. I think it's just the financial system of how that goes down.
Something I see a lot in so many industries where they say, oh, there are advantages to having the software, and you can even do like the over-the-air updates, since you can update it whenever is necessary. But that means you have to have staff who are supporting that and developing it and improving it the whole time. And that's the part where it comes to a vehicle where designing it and shipping it, you can't just stop there. The problem with Apple and Google making Android is that they are only really they're developing software and interfaces, but it's really only intended for entertainment. So that's why CarPlay and the Android version are popular in cars, but they're only add-ons. It's because all these vehicle manufacturers, they need the systems for controlling your central air systems, vehicle features, navigation, all this extra stuff that is actually integrated with the car systems, and none of these other tech companies actually have experience in. They have experience on the software side, not the
You really
canvas.
need to be able to firewall that pretty well so that an over-the-air update for the entertainment system that is not quite right doesn't cause the rest of the vehicle to stop working,
Exactly.
like a CrowdStrike sort of thing.
Yeah, speaking of, why did they stop partnering with Microsoft? It might have actually been for the best. Not
Yeah.
because of Microsoft, but because of CrowdStrike. Yeah. To summarize, those are the two issues that it's the how do you actually fund the ongoing software maintenance and support, and are there companies who really specialize in the automotive integration, not just the user interface, user experience on the sort of entertainment side. But I do agree with what you've all said about, like, they should try to outsource as much as possible and not try to own all of it.
Oh, you mean like Boeing? Okay. Why don't we move on?
I know, we've
How
got
about
so many
that?
good examples.
Yes. All right. Land Rover Defender windshield recall needed, alleged lawsuit. I'll read a good bit of this. This is from the carcomplaints.com. A Land Rover Defender windshield recall is allegedly needed because the glass cracks because of defects that cause drivers to spend a lot of money in repairs. According to a class action lawsuit, the 2020 through 2022 Defender windshield recall should have been issued long ago, but Land Rover forces owners to pay up to $2,000 to replace the glass. In addition, Defender customers are told to cover the cost even when the vehicles are under warranty. The windshields allegedly chip, crack, or break from the smallest pebbles hitting the glass. Defender customers also complain the windshields can crack even with no impacts to the glass. Land Rover has allegedly known a Defender windshield recall was necessary since 2019, but conceals that information from consumers. Oh, by the way, that's when the new model came out. The plaintiffs assert that Defender windshields crack and chip either because the glass is defective or because the problems with the vehicle structure. Even if Defender owners pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to replace the cracked windshield, Land Rover allegedly installs an equally defective windshield that will also fail. If the message boards out on Facebook are any indication, I'm shocked there isn't already a lawsuit, because there are a lot of people talking about their cracked, damaged, and waiting months for new windshields too. This seems like there's a lot of them.
Cracked windscreens seem to be an area of particular interest to you, John.
Yes, it seems to be a Land Rover theme over the number of years, especially with a Freelander.
So apparently the Freelander team is now designing the windscreens for the new Defender.
And aside from it being a safety thing, it's also one of those things that Land Rover has an easy out, that it is a windscreen, that it's too easy to say, oh, I'm sorry, it just got chipped and it cracked. We don't do road hazard insurance. Yeah, it is especially frustrating. And I know not all states are like this, but Vermont, we have annual inspections for vehicles, and any crack basically larger than a quarter in length or like a dime in size that is anywhere except in the very peripheral of the windows, like that's a failed inspection.
I think that is most places, actually.
In Pennsylvania, the crack has to be in the driver's field of vision. So depending on the inspector you get, like on a series truck that has the split panes, the one pane that's not in front of the driver can be completely gone and it'll still pass inspection because it's not in front of the driver.
Yep.
All right, let's move on then to Jaguar's Canadian dealers threaten lawsuits over JLR's EV shift. We finally had some Canadian news, so Dixon's back, right? We want to add that in.
Dixon is here to present the Canadian perspective.
Yes, I'll read you the three headlines here, or the three top points. Jaguar is in the midst of reinventing the brand, reducing sales volume, and going EV only. JLR is looking to trim down the number of Jaguar outlets across Canada. Dealers who invested heavily in the brand are not satisfied and want compensation. What say you, Dixon?
The dealers bought into all of the sales projections from JLR, which were some 7,000 or 8,000 vehicles a year. And with the change in strategy to going EV only, Jaguar is currently looking at selling some 700 units per year in Canada, which is a small reduction of 90%. And the dealerships are obviously rather displeased about this. They put in a lot of money in building dealerships that were half Land Rover, half Jaguar. And now there's not going to be that much in the way of Jaguar on the floor plan. So it looks like they're going, according to this, they're going to go and have a run at JLR, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, this doesn't say how many dealers there are in Canada. At least I didn't see it in this article. I'm curious what ultimately that number would be. And are they going to separate Jaguar from Land Rover then? And is that going to happen here in the U.S. too, where they're going to have a reduction in Jaguar dealerships?
They could certainly do that by just eliminating the Jaguar dealership because usually they're half and half dealerships, just make it all Land Rover. Actually, sorry, Defender, Discovery, and Range Rover dealerships.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, I wonder if they should include the number of signs that they now have to put on their dealership, that they went from 2 to 5,
Yes.
and now there's
It's probably some local ordinance that's going to cause some trouble too. But it'll be very interesting to see where this goes.
Yeah, and I think this might impact the U.S. eventually too. Just the change in this plan. And if the Canadians are getting concerned, the U.S. dealers will get
The
involved.
Canadians will set the precedent that the U.S. dealers will follow.
Land Rover Canada is completely a creature of Land Rover North America out of New Jersey. So it could be that LRNA is going and trying to see what's going to happen vis-a-vis using Canada as the test bed. And if it's successful and everything else, maybe they'll do it in the United States too.
All right, next, JLR axes all but one ICE vehicle, and this is actually the Jaguar line. According to comments made by Adrian Mardell, the JLR CEO, at a recent investor day, the Jaguar F-Pace SUV will be the only car to remain in production from the brand's current lineup. 5 models have been axed, including the XE Sports Saloon, the XF Premium Saloon and Wagon, and the F-Type sports car, all of which have saw production cease at Castle Bromwich in May. Quote, "We are eliminating 5 products, all lower value. None of those are vehicles of which we made any money, so we are replacing them with new vehicles on newly designed architectures," unquote.
Which we also won't make any money on.
They certainly hope they do.
So that's the hope. Let's hope it works out for them.
And next, did you know it's the 35th anniversary of the Discovery? Land Rover does, but they're not doing anything here in North America, but they do have a kind of a 35th anniversary over in the UK, and I think in Europe too. It's a Land Rover Discovery is getting a 345 brake horsepower mild hybrid option. And so this article from Top Gear, would you believe the Discovery is 35 years this year? As part of the celebrations, Land Rover has announced all new D350 mild hybrid version, which replaces the outgoing D300 and delivers around 345 horsepower to all 4 wheels, an increase of 49 over its predecessor. Torque has also seen a slight bump to 516 foot-pounds for the 3-liter 6-cylinder diesel unit, and thanks to the introduction of the 48-volt battery, the Disco's newest form should be slightly more adept at lower revs than when the going gets muddy. And note, of course, we do not get the diesel here in the U.S. or North America.
Oh, of course not.
The 0 to 60
Because it's cool. We don't get it.
That's right. The 0 to 60 run has also been cut down to 5.9 seconds. Yield is an estimated 34 miles per gallon. That's commendable given the 7-seat Leviathan tips the scales at nearly 2.5 tons. So there's your 35th anniversary edition Disco.
Keep in mind those figures are probably metric tons and imperial gallons. Your mileage might vary.
In 25 years when you can bring it into the U.S.
Yeah, other than this model, I think they're probably commemorating the 35th anniversary of the Discovery with the least amount of fanfare possible.
And the big news for this month is the Land Rover Defender OCTA from Motor Trend. This is the 2025 Land Rover Defender OCTA prototype first ride. Read you various parts of this. Yes, it's called OCTA, and yes, it's an acronym you should pronounce like a word. It's short for octahedron, the most common shape of a cut diamond, like the kind of an engagement ring. Yes, the badge features a 4-point diamond instead of an 8-point one, as the OCTA abbreviation would suggest. But as SVO boss Jamil Hamidi explains, it is reductive and visually easier to read and therefore more recognizable. I just had to mention that he used the word reductive. I wonder where he got that word from. That's important because you won't want to dwell what it's called, but rather what it does. Hamidi will never say it, but after just a brief ride in the OCTA prototype, one comes to the inescapable conclusion that he wanted to outdo himself. If the name rings familiar, it's because he was the chief engineer of Ford Performance, and before that, of Ford Special Vehicles team, and responsible for products like, nearly every Ford Raptor in existence. To be mildly vulgar, the OCTA is the most badass Defender Land Rover can build within the confines of the law. As Media explains, it's not something customers were specifically asking for, but rather an internal challenge to see how far SVO team could take the Defender while keeping it road legal.
Apparently, it defies the laws of physics because there's not a picture taken where it's not in the air.
That's the new air suspension.
You're right. We'll get there. From the outside, OCTA looks like a Defender with big tires and fender flares, but the subtlety belies the engineering at work. Those visual cues are indicative of what's at play. Fully kitted out, OCTA wears 20-inch wheels, as small as the engineers could go, and still fit 15.7-inch brakes and Bembro calipers in either custom-made Goodyear, Wrangler, Duratec RT all-terrain tire that shares nothing with their name but with other Goodyear tires, BF Goodrich tire, trail terrain option that trades a bit of the off-road grip for road holding, or 22-inch wheel wrapped in Michelin street tires that raise the top speed to 130 miles per hour, a likely record for all terrains, to 155 miles per hour. Hamidi says that the OCTA went through roughly 1 million kilometers of testing on and off-road without a single flat tire. Quote, "We set out to do everything a G63 could do on road, but not compromise the off-road capability," unquote. The lift increased the maximum approach and departure angles to 42 and 43 degrees respectively. Breakover is up to 29 degrees. Derived from the same parts tuned for performance of the Range Rover SV, the OCTA adds 1.4 inch of front and 0.4 inch of rear wheel travel over a standard Defender 110. The 6D hydraulic suspension system featuring tri-valve shocks that are probably the most important upgrade of all. The first two valves are the kind you've heard of before, controlling compression and rebound dampening at each corner. The third valve is what separates it from the likes of the Rivian. That last valve disconnects its dampener from the other three as needed, its hydraulic equivalent of disconnecting the anti-roll bars. This means the OCTA is better at keeping its wheels on the ground in extreme situations, whereas a standard Defender 110 might get crossed up with the wheel hanging in the air over deeply uneven terrain. The OCTA is more likely to keep all four wheels on the ground. Decoupling the wheels from one another over the most difficult terrain also has the effect of greatly reducing head toss in the cabin, as riding in the OCTA and a standard 110 back-to-back amply demonstrates. I wish they would have compared this to a classic Defender 2, throwing it around. All right, we're getting more.
It depends on whether you have 80s hair metal playing on the stereo too, doesn't it?
The OCTA isn't just fancy dampeners. There's also a monster V8 to consider. After all, the only thing more fun than going off-road is going off-road faster. Land Rover has bought BMW's delightful 4.4-liter twin-turbo mild hybrid V8, stuffed it into the Defender's diamond-plated hood, and tuned it to 626 horsepower, 553 pound-feet of torque, or as much as 590 pound-feet while in launch control. The SVO team says that it's good for 0 to 60. This is a new Defender, the Land Rover new Defender, 3.8 seconds. And fitted with dual snorkels, a wetting depth of 39.3 inches, nearly 4 more than a standard Defender 110. To take advantage of the engine and suspension, there are 2 new drive modes. On road, there's an updated dynamic mode that should make the Octa really handle like a really tall sports car. Those are their words. Off-road Octa mode, activated by the new diamond button below the horn that turns the paddle shifters red, sets the big SUV up like a rally car with rear-biased power, compliant dampeners, off-road calibrated anti-lock braking, and loosened traction and stability controls. Also, off-road launch control, because yes.
I mean, the videos of it in that mode are pretty impressive, seeing it semi-drifting around corners.
Yeah, they were very excited about doing the drifting, yes.
Well, who isn't?
At nearly 2.7 inches wider than a Defender 110 and sporting yellow clearance lights out of necessity rather than fashion, the Octa will struggle with narrow or trails. It is, according to Hamidi, as wide as they could get with and still get the truck through European cities. The overall effect is one that convinces you that an Octa could be driven down most dirt roads, exceeding freeway speeds with no consequences. It honestly feels as though the truck could plow over and through anything short of a crater without damage. Quite frankly, Ford Raptors wish they could go this hard, with this little effect translated to the driver. No small part of it, according to Hamidi, is the independent suspension that doesn't have to deal with heavy, solid axle like other rigs he's worked on. We call Defender a decathlete, Hamidi said. It does everything well. You can push the off-road capabilities out, but our mantra was we cannot degrade anything else, unquote. And there's a lot more in this article. You're invited to go read it yourself. These were kind of the highlights I thought I pulled out, and this concludes here. We're left with the impression that the Defender Octa will be on sale before the year is out, though Land Rover hasn't committed to a specific date yet. The fancier-looking Edition 1, with its special paint, wheels, and carbon fiber trim inside and out, will be a single model year deal with sales limited to 4,000 units. Those will retail for $169,275, while regular Octas, which aren't limited production, will cost $153,475. Yes, that's expensive, but Land Rover has kept a watchful eye on the ever-increasing G-Wagon prices and sees no reason it can't follow the same path. For now, Octa treatment is exclusive to the 4-door Defender 110, thanks to its more stable long wheelbase, but Hamidi won't roll out other iterations. Asked about the 2-door Defender 90 Octa, he simply demurred, so watch for more to potentially come. That's your Defender Octa.
I'm having a hard time getting past hearing the words 20-inch and smallest wheels possible in the same sentence.
I also love on JLR's promotional site for the Defender Octa, when they're showing off the tires, they actually say a range of, and I'm quoting here, a range of specially developed 33-inch diameter tires, the largest ever fitted to a Defender. I'm like, no, just factory.
Yeah, the largest they've ever fitted.
Exactly. And go visit Iceland. There have been larger tires fitted to a Defender.
Yeah, walk up to a Defender in Iceland and you're eye level with the lug nuts pretty much.
When they are competing with the likes of the G-Wagon, they at least seem to be making this a lot more fun. And I like some of the suspension stuff that they're doing because that has, like, they've always had the sort of drive technology to make the current new Defenders, 90s, 110s, 130s, still perform pretty well off-road. That air suspension doesn't give them a lot of flex. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this really performs.
From looking at the picture, I get the sense that those tires are going to last forever because they're always just in the air.
They never touch the ground,
Yeah.
It's a sharp-looking car. I think I like what they've done with the widening, although I'm curious to see how much wider it is up close to the standard 110.
I don't think the body itself is any wider. It's just bigger fender flares, but the length of the wheels being further apart puts it over the width standards for where you have to start carrying the clearance lamps.
Okay, that's what it is then. It's the widening.
Yeah, it's all about the axle
base.
length.
Okay, axle length.
Yeah, the track width is the key. GM did that a number of years ago and it started doing some rear steering on their pickups for maneuverability, but it made the axle just wide enough that even on a half-ton, you needed the clearance lamps.
And as we know his work from the Raptor line, he likes doing a wider stance, pushing as much as possible. It does help for stability, especially at the higher speeds that they're pushing.
I suspect it's impressive and probably does the trick. And if you can afford it, why not? It looks
And I actually
looks the business.
really like the new reductive seats. I just don't like the word reductive.
Reductive is overused.
I would like to see some reductivism.
Yes.
And yeah, that does seem to be a problem. It's anytime they make a change, it's always they throw the word reductive in there, even if it has nothing to do with it.
It sounds like they're taking stuff out, but it usually comes with a huge increase in price.
Yes.
Right.
And there's really nothing reductive about this.
Yeah, certainly not in the price.
No.
No.
Well, $180,000, something like that.
170 for the edition 1, which is a one-time year only, but it's normally like 160, which is probably the base, and I'm sure you can go up from there.
Oh yeah, and then you add your destination charges and all your other stuff.
Right.
And in this special edition, the first edition, the seats, they look like a really nice 60s, 70s leather sports car seat. It's not that it's reductive. It just is. It's
Fit for
simpler.
purpose.
You haven't sat in one yet.
Right.
Your actual sitting experience might belie the experience, but hopefully not.
From my reading and things I saw about this, it does seem, I think fit for purpose is the better word, and it does seem like it's a rally car. It's almost like a production rally car from Rover.
Right.
And priced accordingly. You know what? There's probably some Bowler influence in this. It was never mentioned, but I wouldn't be surprised since they bought Bowler, 5 years ago or so.
Yeah, I think you cross Bowler with the Raptor team, and this is what you get.
All right. Concluding, I said that there was light on news, and time doesn't seem to indicate that because we talked a lot about other things. But
this is still going to be a long episode, no matter what.
We want to talk to Dixon, get a little update on the.
No, I'm just referring to the length of our guest interview, which balances everything out.
Yes.
I still came away with lots and lots of questions I would have asked if we'd had another 2.5 hours.
Yeah, I think that most of our listeners probably, if they've stuck around to be our listeners this long, they're going to be like us and get to the end and be like, that was it? There's so much.
Yeah, we need to get him back for a volume 2.
Yes, definitely. So concluding with this video called Jesus Jeep. I don't know. I saw this video.
It's an amusing subtitle.
It is a rare sight from the Thames, Jeep on an rubber inflatable, Land Rover on a rubber inflatable. And it says, please put your comments in case you recognize this event in the YouTube channel. 6 people have liked this video. 247 people subscribed to Thames Boats. Of course, we'll have a link to this in the show notes. But no one has commented on it. So no one has any idea what was going on. All it is a 110, classic 110 on 2 inflatable pontoons. And it looks like the rear wheels are spinning. The front wheels are not. Our assumption is there's a propeller there that is driving it from the rear drive shaft. Don't know what's going on. Was this for a movie? Was this someone just having some fun? No idea.
So there are no comments because all of the people who have seen this are rendered speechless.
I blame the algorithm. Google doesn't push enough Land Rover content.
When in doubt, always blame the algorithm.
Yes.
It's so easy.
That is an interesting video. It reminds me of another one. If you go to the defenderx.com website, it features a pair of Defenders out on quite a journey through different countries and so on, and includes a short video which shows a pair of Defenders on very similar looking pontoons. So I think you have found something that is interesting and has not been very well publicized so far.
It says here their mission is to drive from London to New York, covering 3/4 of the Earth's circumference, over 18,000 miles of highway, 3,400 miles of frozen tundra, 1,000 miles of river and ocean, through the coldest places on Earth, the most dangerous strait and untracked wilderness in 2 highly temperamental Land Rover Defenders.
Temperamental?
Those pontoons are going to be interesting crossing the Bering Strait.
Yeah.
If they're going to do that.
This looks like this is supposed to happen back in 2023.
Yeah. London to New York the hard way.
Interesting.
Go around the other way. The
It's
pontoons might not make it across the North Atlantic.
They would if they were sitting on a row. Very
out-
easy drive New York to London if you drive it onto a big boat and then drive it off at the other end.
Yeah, the logo for Defender X is the same one that seems to be in that video. It looks very similar. May not be exactly, but it looks similar.
Does.
Harold, with the Roro, you got to figure out the right RPM and gear to set your Land Rover in while it's on the Roro, but up on stilts or something, up on stands, so that it gets the correct mileage by the time it gets to the other shore.
Yeah, of course you could always, when you overshoot, you could always just spin it around when you get off the boat and do the Ferris Bueller thing.
Exactly.
All right, that's the news for July 2024. Have a good time at the North Star Rover Rally. And now welcome, very special welcome to the CentreSteer podcast, the Defender of Defenders, Will Hedrick.
Hey.
Welcome to the show.
Yes, sir. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And this is a special day. We're recording this on July 15th, and it's exactly the 10-year anniversary of when the Defender of Defenders kicked off. I guess it would have been 2014. So
Yeah, it didn't seem like it's been 10 years, but
Time flies.
Time passes quickly, especially when you stay busy.
And if you're not sure what the Defender of Defender reference is all about, we'll get there. But basically, Will saved Defenders from being crushed by the United States government.
It's a long story, and I'm terrible at telling short ones, but we'll cover that during the discussions this evening.
The irony is, I think you got this case resolved in record time.
Yeah, no, that was nothing short of a miracle. And I can't take all the credit for it. The clients were heavily involved, but it's to the point that we got it in the time we got it resolved. And I even seasoned attorneys who I worked with, mentor even that I worked with, said it was nothing short of a miracle. Like I said, I can't take all the credit for it, but I'm glad that we were able to sort it out. And the big thing for me was that all those vehicles got returned at no cost to the owners. And that was the end goal for me.
Even though you can't take all the credit, I'm sure everyone's giving it to you anyway.
The name Defender of Defenders, it wasn't one that I came up with. It was one that was bestowed on me by a friend and a member of the Land Rover community, and it just got picked up. And
I think that was a T-shirt fundraiser, wasn't it, originally?
Yeah, so it went on to become, and I actually have a couple still in my collection, one of which I've had to cut the sleeves off of because I've worn it out. But yeah, it made its way around, and then when the automotive media picked up the story not long after it happened, the name just stuck, and they kept using it, and I just came to be known for it. And I actually went on to trademark it so that there weren't any issues with JLR, which that was becoming apparent at the time. But as long as I stay in my lane over here in the legal attorney context, then we don't really have any issues in any other aspect.
They finally got around to copywriting their vehicle names?
Yeah, no, that's a whole nother story. Wow. And I do keep up with that. But there actually was a case from a few years back where JLR and Bombardier they were litigating over the Defender name. That's a longer story.
Before we get to that full story of how you became the Defender of Defenders, how did you become a Land Rover person?
Oh, wow. We're going to jump all the way back to high school.
Just last year, right? That was maybe 10 years ago.
Your obsession started that late in life, huh?
Yeah, I've actually never seen a proper Land Rover until I was in high school, or at least not that I knew of. There was one, an older one, Series 3, that was down way outside of town. I'd pass by it every once in a while, but I didn't really think anything of it. And it looked like it was just sitting in a junk pile. But there was a kid who was a senior at the time. I was a sophomore. And I passed by him one day, and he was driving a brand new Alpine White Defender 90 with just the half cage. Didn't have the full cage on it. And I just did a double take, and I was like, who was that? What vehicle was that? And I just spun around. I was actually driving a Jeep at the time, and I followed him back to see where his house was. And I was like, what is this vehicle? Because when you're a high school kid, you've got no fear about stopping and talking to anybody. Of course, but I found out what it was, and he had bought it. Then this was in 94-ish. He had just bought it from the local Land Rover dealer, and it was one of the first ones that had come in. And he was the son of the local golf pro in town. And yeah, after that, I was hooked. I bought my first Defender when I was in college, and I had been looking for a long time. And I just, being a high school kid and then a college kid, it wasn't something that I had the funding for to go out and look. So I actually had made a little college thing when I was in college of searching for salvage Defenders, and I actually developed quite a reputation for being able to locate them, and ended up developing a relationship with a gentleman Atlanta, Georgia, who would actually buy them when I found them, and then I would help them resell them. And I had a website called roverx.com. It's got known in that sense to the world, or the Land Rover world. And ultimately, I never bought a salvage Defender. I actually ended up buying one that I found called, do you remember the Land Rover Exchange?
Yep. Oh, yeah.
So, so LRX back in the day, a guy in Albuquerque, New Mexico, posted up a red 1994 Defender at that time, he advertised it with around 99,000 miles on it, which at that point was high mileage. And the saving grace for me, and the way that I was actually ended up being able to get it, was because he didn't put his telephone number in the ad. He had only listed his email. So I took his name, and this was like in the early days of search engines, and was able to track down his phone number and called this name out of the blue. Are you the guy with the Defender for sale? And he said, yes. And I said, I'm sending you money right now. I'm going to fly out, in 3 days, and I'm going to drive it home. And I think he thought I was crazy. Actually, the really funny part of that story was when I arrived in Albuquerque at the airport, he was picking me up, and he said, don't worry, I'll be easy to spot. I will be the only red Defender at the airport. As it turns out, this was not true. There was actually another red Defender 90 soft top at the airport that same day. And it was right outside the terminal when I walked outside. And I initially thought that was him and said no. At any rate, jumped in that vehicle, actually started driving back to North Carolina, did that almost straight through. And,
did you have any problems on that trip, or did you take any tools with you?
No, I didn't have any problems to speak of, although I was initially caught off guard between Albuquerque and Amarillo when the engine would stall out above, I think it was 80 miles an hour, but I came to learn after the fact that was the governor on the vehicle that was limiting my speeds. So didn't have any issues with it after that. But
you're doing 80 plus in a Defender, you're on your own, pal.
All right. No, I mean,
you would think the suspension would have let you know before any governor kicked in.
And I was a college kid at that point in time. I didn't know any different. And I'd been driving Jeeps to that point, so it really wasn't that. But 2 weeks after I got back to North Carolina, the transfer case let loose. And so it was down for about a month until I was able to get another transfer case to go into it. That was really my first Defender experience. And I had that vehicle all the way up until 2003. And I actually had a couple other Defenders in between then.
Before we do that, get on to your other ones. What did you do with the D90? Did you take it off-road? Did you take trips? Was it your daily driver? And did you name it?
All of the above. And yes, Land Rover was its name. Just the classic. I had it on the license plate and everything. Although mine said R3D, RV3R, because somebody else already had Land Rover. Actively involved in the Old Norse Land Rover Society. It went on to served as an executive officer in a couple of different clubs in North Carolina. And since I'm now an honorary member of the Old Norse State, as well as several other clubs around the country. But yeah, no, was a trail guide, trail leader. And then after I graduated from college, I actually pursued a position working with Land Rover Center or Land Rover Group. What eventually became known as Land Rover Carolinas Group, which owned 4 stores at that time. There was Greenville, South Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, and then what would ultimately be Hilton Head, Savannah. And I worked at all 4 of these stores. As far as I can remember, I was the only salesperson who worked between all 4 of the stores. And I was there when Hilton Head actually opened, so it was a brand new store at the time.
And as I understand it, during that period of time, you had the distinction of selling the very last North American spec Defender in this country.
Yes, so number 300 of 300. It was a willow green limited edition or last edition, as it were. And so when our dealer principal, who served on the Land Rover North America's president's cabinet when he owned dealerships, he had been promised to receive the last 1995 Defender station wagon. And for one reason or another, that didn't happen. In lieu of that, they promised him that he would get the last 1997 Defender, which they did. And he promptly put it into storage. It came out occasionally. It might get driven to a show here and there. And we would also display it in the dealer or center showrooms between the 4 stores. in 2003, which seems to be a year I keep coming back to. I think y'all may remember there was a concept Defender that was brought to SEMA, which they refer to as the number 501 to 500 project. Do y'all remember that?
That one I
No,
don't
it's before
remember.
my tenure.
Yeah, that one I don't remember.
So number 501 to 500 was a complete knockdown Defender, or CKD, that had been assembled at Ford/Land Rover's in Sao Paulo plant in Brazil, and had been brought into the U.S. as a concept, which Land Rover North America was actively pursuing at the time. And the idea was to be able to sell Defender kits through the Land Rover Center Parts Department.
Wow.
Or you could buy their basically Defender in kit form and then assemble it yourself.
Selling CKDs at retail, basically.
In the U.S.
Wow.
I can tell you that was real, and that was actually slated to happen because I was given the directive to sell number 300, and he wouldn't have sold it otherwise. But ultimately, and unfortunately, Ford Motor Company, when their attorneys got a hold of that, they killed it. And so that never came to fruition.
Yes. What was number 300? Was that a D90 or D110?
A 90.
It was
So
a 90,
Willow
okay.
Green station wagon with checker plating all over it and the full Safari roof rack, automatic transmission, 4.0 V8. And it had, I think, around 500 miles on it at the time. And that was just mileage from being moved
Do you know
between
what
the
happened to
dealerships.
it?
Yeah, actually, right before the pandemic hit, I was contacted by an auto auction, getting a company. They were having a sale out in Scottsdale, Arizona. So this was January of 2019. And they were trying to trace some history on the vehicle. And the dealer principal, who I used to work for, is actually one of my clients, and he referred them to me. And I actually have copies of all the bills of sales still from every vehicle I ever sold while I was working for the dealership, and one of which was for that vehicle. And
You
I was
are a Rover nut. Yes, you've saved all your bills of sale. That's excellent. That's excellent.
And an attorney, because he's covering his butt on every transaction.
That's right.
Yeah,
20 years later, he still has the bill of sale from the ones he sold. I love it.
Yeah, they invited me to come out to Scottsdale for the sale. I was actually, as it turns out, already headed out that way anyway. I had a client's vehicle, U.S. military service member whose vehicle it didn't get picked up by the transporter at the port when it arrived into Baltimore. So I actually went up, chased it, collected it. And there is a whole history behind this vehicle I can't necessarily go into, but we got into the country. And I actually delivered it to him out west at the base where he was stationed.
You drove it from Baltimore then? Is that what that means?
I trailed it.
Okay.
Yeah. So I trailed it out west and dropped it at the base where he was stationed, and then went on to Arizona for that. And then that same month, actually that same week, also was invited by members of the Arizona Land Rover Owners Club, the AZLRO, to go with them to the 4x4 event that was being hosted in Palm Springs. So I went from the Gooding & Company sale, where I wasn't there the evening that they sold the Defender, but I was there and actually saw it. I have some photos of me with the vehicle. And that was the first time I'd seen it since 2003.
Is it still around? Do we know? Or did someone take it and put it into their collection and not to be seen again?
My understanding is the person who bought it, they're driving it. I knew that prior to that, it actually had been in New Mexico and had been being driven there. It looked pretty much the same, one or two changes, but nothing major. It had been well maintained and kept, and otherwise it looks pretty close to it. I remembered it. I think they had just taken a couple of the spotlights off of the roll bar. That was the one thing that I noticed that had been changed. But other than that, everything else was just as I remembered it.
It's been living in a dry climate, which is good for it too.
Yeah, it's a very cool truck. And just, I never actually, I think I drove a new Defender. I've actually ever owned a new Defender, but that was as close as I think as I got to having one that I would call new that I got to drive. But it's a very cool truck.
To me, a new Defender is 25 years in a couple days.
Yeah, and I actually look at the new, I say new, that's how I refer to most current model year, that's eligible as a quote unquote new model year Defender. So we've just come into 99 in the next year. So TD5s have just become eligible for import. And again, when you see that abroad, you see the values spiking up.
Oh yeah. I remember when 300 TDI was an L.
Yeah, it's been interesting. There was a case that I handled that posts the bid case involving a U.S. Army warrant officer who imported a vehicle that had an engine change, and it wasn't a 300 TDI, but it was a 200 TDI. And it's one that had the engine change as a result of a kit that Land Rover offered, or rather a retrofit kit that was
I remember those.
Yep. The EPA and their body U.S. Customs had basically rejected the vehicle to be allowed for entry into the U.S. They didn't seize it, but they just said, no, it can't come in. And then they put it into a warehouse where it was, in essence, detained. I ended up taking up that case, and we took it up to the U.S. Court of International Trade, where ultimately I made the case to the EPA and to U.S. Customs that, hey, this engine actually has lower emissions than the engine that originally came into this vehicle. And really, it's a nonsensical result that you're chasing here. So what's the point? In addition, the engine that's in the vehicle, the original 2.5 normally aspirated diesel engine that had been in it, utilized more or less the exact same engine block design that was in the 200 TDI. In fact, if you were going to look at a late model 19J engine, it actually has the same part number as the 200 TDI. There's no difference between the two. So
block, crank, pistons, front cover, that stuff's all the same part.
Yeah, the only really difference is the head, and then the direct injection, which is the big add for the 200 TDI.
And the turbo.
And the turbo, yes, all right. But all these bolt-on ancillary parts underneath the EPA's regulation, as it turned out, didn't have any effect. And this is one of the funny irony, not funny, haha, but so the way that the EPA 3520-1 declaration form used to read was you could have a replacement engine, but it had to be, in quote, an equivalent engine or equivalent or newer EPA certified engine, or basically an equivalent engine or newer EPA certified engine. And I made the case to the EPA and U.S. Customs that when it says equivalent or, the or means or, not and, which is the way that they had been reading it as like, or and have two different meanings. Or means it can be this, or it can be this. It's not this and this. Since then, since it's all in that case, they've actually now revised the form to eliminate that. That doesn't apply anymore. It's actually, in a roundabout way, had an effect on the way they draft their declaration forms, which I thought was, well, for me, it's humorous, but that.
So what does that mean now for importing?
So basically, the way the form was revised now is that you have to, if it's going to have a replacement engine, it has to have the exact same model engine in order to qualify.
So
for
they tightened
US
up
entry.
the rule then, is what is effectively what's that?
Yeah, I mean,
They took away the loophole that you pointed out.
correct. And I don't think it was a loophole per se. I think it was correctly written the first time, but they did not want that to continue.
They didn't want that
At the
ambiguity
time of the-
anymore.
At the time of the import, the 200 TDI was old enough to be eligible for the exemption, right?
Correct.
So substantively, the truck would have still been certifiable.
Correct. Yeah, but it's, again, the way that their exemption form reads, or at least for the EPA, is that it had to be that the same engine or so an equivalent or newer at the time. And so the funny thing is, so there's three actually really different federal agencies that get involved in the evaluation of these vehicles. One is the EPA, but usually they're the last agency that gets consulted. But prior to that, it'll be NHTSA, and in particular, Office of Vehicle Safety Compliance. And they'll be the first one to read the vehicle. And then there's communication that takes place there between them and the U.S. representative for Jaguar Land Rover North America. And this is, in my experience, where there tends to be a breakdown in the communication. I refer to it as kind of like a telephone game, because information is getting passed back and forth between these businesses and government agencies, and the information that ultimately gets conveyed to U.S. Customs isn't always the exact information or the correct information as it should have been conveyed, which is shown time and time again through the representations that I've undertaken in these cases. Again, most recently, a vehicle that I picked up from U.S. Customs just a few weeks back. So it's tedious at times, and I have to how shall I say? I mean, I have a relationship with Jaguar Land Rover and people who work with Jaguar Land Rover, so I have to be careful not to step on the company's toes too much. But at the same time, it's a case of being able to have the latitude to point out, hey, this isn't right. You need to go back and look at this again and get this straightened out. And ultimately, where I'm able to show that I can get the vehicles released and the client doesn't end up being able having to pay storage fees and penalties, et cetera, like that to U.S. Customs. And again, it's just based on information that just wasn't conveyed. But I can see in certain circumstances where a lot of these mistakes happen because in many cases, these vehicles will have parts from 2, if not 3 or more different vehicles because they're
At least.
Yeah, if you float in the circles with people who do business in the UK, you'll probably hear the phrase "triggers burn," and there are certain things that have to be original in NHTSA's view in order for the vehicle to be eligible for U.S. import. But one of the things that happened in 2016 was basically a request for guidance that was delivered to NHTSA's basically general counsel on behalf of Twisted in the UK. And they were looking for guidance on being able to bring vehicles over that had been, in their view, restored. NHTSA took advantage of the opportunity to very narrowly define what they consider to be a restored vehicle versus one that was newly manufactured. And basically in response, I said, no, what you're doing constitutes a newly manufactured vehicle, not a restored one. And that kind of brought the lid down for quite a number of people. And I think that it bit a number of the specialist restorers overseas as they were shipping vehicles in, and they had to change the way that they were doing business as a result.
Did that also impact the Japanese market too? Because I know they're bringing in Skylines and other such things.
To some degree, I've handled some Japanese imports. I don't typically find that I've had as many issues, or at least not been contacted regarding as many issues regarding those or concerning those. But I mean, they are subject to a lot of the same or similar issues. But I think it's a little bit more difficult than it is with a Land Rover. Especially one of the difficult things about Defenders in particular is the number of locations for which final production actually happened. So for the most part, with Nissans, your production was happening in Japan. But with Land Rover, it could have been happening in the UK. It could have been happening at least 3 or 4 different locations in Africa. It could have been happening in Malaysia. It could have been happening in actually eligible now or coming into eligibility or ones that were built in South America. They were doing complete lockdown production all over the place. Australia, Central America, Turkey. There are a lot of variations in the way the vehicles were assembled. Turkey, for instance, at Otokar, they produced and manufactured their own frames.
Yep.
So they weren't using chassis that had been built in the UK.
I'm learning to read Turkish. I have a Turkish truck in my shop right now.
Yep. And so they have their own, what are referred to as child part numbers for the different parts that are utilized on the vehicles. These are internally used part numbers. And so
they have their own interpretation of the color code for the wiring.
So I have one of the vehicles I have right now is a 1997 Defender 110 2.8i, which was actually a gift given to me by my clients in the big case, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But it was fully assembled in Africa, in South Africa, during the time the Land Rover was owned by BMW. And it's one of only a few hundred 110 station wagons that were built with the BMW M52 inline 6-cylinder petrol engine. Basically the same engine that you would have gotten in the Z3 back in the late 90s. But it's very unique in terms of what it is and the engineering behind it. But it utilizes a lot of components that are the same as the V8 chassis and drivetrain that were just adapted to. I became friends with the gentleman who was an engineer who worked on the project. His name's Frank Eisenberg, and Frank's a great guy. But he, you get a chance to talk to him, he'll tell you about walking through the shop in South Africa one day when he was assigned there with BMW, and they had a 3 Series, which was getting ready to get this engine into it, and there happened to be a 110 sitting next to it. And he looked at it and he said, I wonder if it'll fit. And then within a day, they had it hanging in the engine bay of the 110. And that was how it started. And everybody in the UK, when you talk to the engineers there, they didn't have a clue what was going on. What are they doing in South Africa? And they were getting requests, and this is all going very, and what's the word I'm looking for? Low key. So they didn't know what was going on. The next thing you know, these vehicles had been approved, and then there was an attempt actually to homologate them into European production, but then BMW sold the company to Ford, and the whole thing went away.
I imagine part of the problem too is that when we're working with 25-year-old minimum vehicles, that electronic records probably only just started around the year 2000 market for a lot of these, and at least for international stuff. Maybe a little earlier than that, but still, it must be really difficult to tease apart things that were maybe paper, maybe digital, or digital in an early period.
Yeah, so it has been tricky at times, and it wasn't helped by the fact that within the last couple of years, some of the executives at Land Rover decided that they, for whatever reason, didn't need traceability, which is the division within the company that was responsible for maintaining these production records. And so they disbanded it. And the records, or paper records they were, and this is almost an urban myth to me at this point, supposedly they were put into a shipping container or 2 shipping containers and then sent to the British Motor Museum, who is the custodian for a significant portion of the remainder of the record. But if you talk to the folks at the British Motor Museum, they've never seen it and they don't know anything about it. So there's no telling where it is, or even if it exists. It does make identification a bit difficult when it comes to the older vehicles. And fortunately for me, because I've laid hands on and looked at and inspected so many of these vehicles, and I've built an independent database that I utilize in order to be able to evaluate. I may not know, for instance, the exact serial number of a given vehicle's axle, but I can usually put it within a range that'll show you that it falls within the range that it's supposed to fall. Same thing for gearboxes, transfer boxes, etc. And some of it actually requires some, I don't want to say reverse engineering, but I can't think of a better term for it, where I'm basically, there's been so much turnover in the company since the 1980s that a lot of the experience, information, documentation that was issued with regard to these vehicles, it's walked out the door or gone out the window. And so there just isn't,
or put into a shipping container.
And there isn't a good source or really a retention within the company of this information. And so these newer people come in who don't really know anything about the older product, and they're asked to identify it. And they don't have the best set of tools to do it with. They don't really know what they're looking at. And misidentification happens all the time.
And they've
And
probably
they
not.
possibly aren't too concerned about it either.
I can't say whether they are or not.
Okay.
I think, so when the evidence is shown to them that if something's wrong, they typically straighten it out. But I've had some difficulty communicating with the company at times over years. And actually, I'm going to clarify that. Not Land Rover in the UK. I've had difficulty communicating with Land Rover, Jaguar Land Rover North America and their representation. I don't know why in particular, but and this is despite efforts I've made to help them in other matters over the years. Bit of a mystery to me, but I continue to do what I do. And I think in a lot of cases, it's almost defaulted to this state of we'll handle it or sort it out.
I suspect a lot of those records have not been digitized either in the UK or here in the US.
See, there are certain records that are digitized, and y'all are probably familiar with the direct dealer warranty system if you work for Land Rover. So some of the information is stored in there. However, that information isn't always accurate. It's subject to human error, just like any other digital system. And so if it's not input correctly, then it results in an error. So I recently looked at a vehicle where information was duplicated with another vehicle. There were 2 vehicles that had the same serial numbers, and they shouldn't have had that. They obviously had 2 different serial numbers for these parts, but if you were to look at one record without looking at the other, you wouldn't know that. Been working on a way to be able to cross-reference part numbers within the systems, something which is difficult to do. I can look at a vehicle now and be able to cross-reference if a vehicle has a part that it was originally fitted with, I can cross-reference and show what vehicle that part was originally fitted to if it was fitted to another vehicle. If it was a genuine part that was replaced under warranty, then I'll be able to show that it wasn't fitted to another vehicle and that it was most likely a part that was fitted as part of warranty or a repair at a different time.
So you've had to become a bit of a forensic archivist in addition to the rest of your roles.
Yeah, I can't speak for everybody, but I don't know that there's another attorney that is as hands-on in this regard as I am. I insist on conducting an in-person inspection of every vehicle that I'm retained to represent in a seizure case. And that, at a minimum, means me crawling underneath the vehicle and around the vehicle for at least 3 hours. And that's wiping off wax oil or having to grind down to get to, not a grinder, but a wire brush down to where I can actually see these serial numbers and record them. And I have come across a vehicle or two in my time that were genuine rares that the VINs have been swapped on them. And in those cases, I let the client know if they're unaware. And in most cases, they are. Most cases, they've bought from another independent party overseas. And I hate to say it, but there are so many people who are novice buyers who really just don't know what they're looking at or who they're dealing with. And they're far too trusting as to what they're getting in a deal. And so they'll purchase a vehicle sight unseen and have not a clue that the vehicle is not the vehicle that it's supposed to be. I had a client a number of years ago who was a service member, military, and I have a relationship that I've developed with the U.S. government contractor responsible for shipping U.S. military, what they call POVs or privately owned vehicles. And then when I first got involved, actually it was a result of the work I did in the warrant officer case with the U.S. Coordination of Trade. But as it turns out, the vice president for this company lives right down the road from me here in Wake Forest. And he emailed me and said, can we get together over a cup of coffee? Because we've got some issues that we think you could help us with. And they were having issues with vehicles getting seized that they had been contracted by DOD to ship. And they didn't understand what the issues were. And I was able to sort it out and design a protocol that they now use for vetting vehicles before they ship from overseas. And in those instances, if there is a vehicle that does appear to be problematic, it has been referred over to me. And this was one of those such cases where a service member purchased a Land Rover. And when I went to inspect it after it had been referred to me, or the photographs that had been sent to me, what I was able to determine relatively quickly is that the vehicle had been stolen. It had the VIN erased, had another VIN placed over it, but the chassis VIN had been altered. And it's just, there was no way that the vehicle was ever going to qualify for a U.S. import. And we get attached to our vehicles. These people are no different. And I had to go back to him, and I felt a bit like I was telling him that he had to shoot his dog because he'd owned this vehicle for a couple of years at that point, had been driving it overseas. And the silver lining, if you can call it that, was that he had actually bought it from what they refer to as a trader, but a dealer over that side of the pond. And the sales and advertising laws are pretty strict in most of those countries. And so where a vehicle had been advertised as being quote unquote U.S. exportable, we were able to force them to take the vehicle back and give him his money back. And actually what they ended up doing was they ended up offering him a different vehicle to replace it. Not exactly the same, but still very nice. Was able to review it, at the time of offer to make sure that it was compliant. Told him, was able to go back and say, yep, this one's good. And we were able to sort out the issue that way. And so to my knowledge, still driving that vehicle here in the U.S.
And it wasn't stolen.
Wasn't stolen.
Will, I wanted to talk more about your Land Rover history, but it's just natural talking to you. We got right into the cases. So why don't we get to it? Get to the case. It's the U.S. versus Land Rover vehicles at all. And the one that brought you to become the Defender of Defenders. And how did that start? And what's it about? And what can you share with our audience?
Yeah, case number 514 CV34F.
You've memorized it, right?
Not only but a client who Harold knows, actually, my guy sent the plaque that I have now on the back of my 110. that has that number on it. So instead of it being a number of, it actually has the case number on it.
Yeah, he has a pair of those made. One he sent to you, and one he put on his own truck.
He sure does. And I've got pictures of that one as well too. So very cool. And I like that. But I'm a number, like I can memorize like that and VIN numbers, etc.
That's a big number to know. That one was a landmark.
Yeah. So at the time, basically on July 15th, 2014, there is all across the U.S. There were 2 cases that were active at that time. There was a criminal investigation into an importer in Wilmington, North Carolina. And then there was a civil case or civil asset forfeiture case involving vehicles that importer had sold. The importer in question was actually 2. There was a company called Patterson Auto Sales, and they had a partnership with an individual by the name of Aaron Risherday, who is based in the Wilmington area, North Carolina. And all the vehicles that they had imported had come in through the port in Wilmington. So it was being investigated by a Homeland Security officer based in Eastern North Carolina. They, in conjunction with the other federal agencies involved, and there were a number of EPA, DOT, HTSA, U.S. Customs, all involved, and the case was filed under seal. Basically, meaning it was private. Nobody could see what was going on, all that information. They had to unseal it later on, but that didn't come for a couple of weeks, or until a couple of weeks afterwards. But at any rate, there was a coordinated raid of all these people's homes. They had no notice that this was going to happen. And in a number of cases, the owners of these vehicles were 2, 3, maybe even 4 owners removed from the original purchasers who had bought these vehicles from the importer in Wilmington.
So they're completely unaware of any issues that might be pending on that.
Yeah, nothing. No clue at all. And these are all reputable people for no reason. But see, to the Homeland Security agents who are used to dealing with drug dealers and illegal importers, they don't know any different, and nobody tells them any different. They don't know that these are innocent owners, and U.S. Customs law doesn't make any accommodations for innocent owners, and that's a whole nother discussion. That's part of the U.S. Customs, what's called a carve-out, whereas in other provisions of civil asset forfeiture law, under federal law, you can't be an innocent owner where you're not held accountable, and you can get your property back without too much fuss. But when it comes to U.S. Customs, that provision doesn't exist, and it makes it a little bit more difficult. So
it also means they show up in riot gear and with big rifles and bang on your door and act tough.
Correct. It's throw you to the ground. A gentleman and his father were thrown to the ground. Again, they had no idea and no expectation as to what was going on. And all I knew was that government showed up taking their vehicle. So at that time, it ended up, this is the beginning of social media, but there was the Defender Source website, what had been D90.com just a few years earlier. And a gentleman went on and posted that Land Security just took my 110. And
that is the title of the thread. It's still there in the archives.
Yep. And then one by one, every single one of the owners seemed to make their way there to this thread. And for those of us in the Rover community, it was just like watching a train wreck. I was watching it from my personal computer and just like couldn't believe that it was going on.
I stayed home from the shop that day to watch it unfold because I got a call at first thing in the morning from a friend of mine who, like, he's on all the forums. He's like, "Hey, isn't this the same guy that sold that truck to your guy?" And yeah, I better go look at that. And wow, it was just, yeah.
Yeah, and I was following it, and then I was contacted by my brother who happened to bump into one of the individuals whose vehicle had been seized. He lived here in town, and my brother referred him over to me and wanted me to talk to him. Basically, that because I was an attorney and because I had actually worked for Land Rover, he thought that I would be able to help him. It wasn't wrong. I decided that I'd meet with the gentleman and find out what the story was, because again, he got me a little bit closer into it, and I was curious as to what the issues were. And his particular vehicle had been alleged to be a 2000 model year vehicle. And I was looking at photographs of it and I said, well, that doesn't add up, because when I'm looking right now doesn't appear to be a 2000 model year vehicle. I got his permission and I reached out to the U.S. Customs, or actually the Homeland Security officer who was local here to our area, and got approval to come look at the vehicle in question. And when I did, what I found was a vehicle that was not a 2000 model year, but in actuality was a 1983 model year. Not only that, but a very early production 1983 110. One of the ones that had was actually an internal company vehicle when it rolled off the assembly line. Inside of a week, I submitted documentation to the Assistant U.S. Attorney showing that, look, not only was this vehicle not a 2000 model year, but there were several other vehicles in the list that were not 2000 model years. He then went on, and those vehicles were dismissed and returned very quickly. So this all happened within a matter of just a few weeks. However, they were reluctant to release the remainder of the vehicle. I took issue with that, as well as did the owners, but I didn't really understand why that had been the case, or why that was the case. And so I was looking at it, and again, it was alleged the vehicles were, in some cases, 25 years old to the day from the date that they entered the country. And from that aspect, it was alleged that they were non-conforming. In addition, it was alleged in certain instances that they didn't have conforming engines. Okay, if that's an allegation, what I then did was I submitted requests, what we refer to as interrogatories, all of the discovery document, requesting information about where they had inspected these vehicles at the time that they had entered the country prior to these times, and they couldn't produce any of that information. And so I then went on to request to conduct inspections of them. And I said, oh, and because of the number of vehicles involved, and because I'm here in North Carolina, you should have to bring them here to North Carolina, and you should pay for it, not me. It's not my client's responsibility. You're the one who made the allegations, so you should have to pay for it to bring them to North Carolina. And we got locked over that issue, and it took the court forever to decide to take up the issue and decide it, which it ultimately didn't do, but we'll get there a little bit further down the road. But these vehicles, the remainder of the vehicles, had been alleged to be anywhere from imported a day early, literally a day earlier than his 25th birthday, to somewhere within 6 months early of its. I'm looking at it from the standpoint of, okay, let's just take a common sense approach to this in the way that the law was written. So it's an exemption that was added into the Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1988 that was enacted by Congress, and there actually is congressional history on this document or this law. And so you can read it. And what you actually find in the process when you're reading through all the congressional documents is that this law, the Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1988, had been heavily lobbied by the automotive manufacturers from outside the U.S. This included Mercedes-Benz, BMW. If Land Rover had really been actively selling that much at the time, I think they would have been involved. I don't recall there being any documents specifically from Land Rover. But the idea was, and this is where these manufacturers were getting upset, at the time, you had what were called gray market imports. So somebody could go to Germany if they wanted to, and they could buy a BMW and import it to the U.S. Meanwhile, in the U.S., BMW was already having to fulfill the requirements of their vehicles to meet federal motor vehicle safety standards that were applicable to all new vehicles that were being imported at the time. And I said, it's not fair to us that we have to spend more money to build these cars, but U.S. customers can come over and buy vehicles in Germany and import them back to the U.S., and they don't have to have these features, these safety features. And more than that, there wasn't so much the safety feature concern, but it was the concern that these rest of the world market cars actually gave the dealers in the U.S. a bad reputation. And this is something I did see translate through to a newer, more modern product sense, or applicable to current day. But the idea is that a vehicle outside the U.S. or rest of the world vehicle doesn't, it's not built to the same standards, and it's not built the same way. And by that, for instance, most of the vehicles built for the rest of the world are built as diesel, not gasoline, which is predominantly what we see here in the U.S. market. And so if you took your German spec BMW to your U.S. BMW dealer, that dealer was likely not to know how to service and or work on your diesel engine. And so the idea then at that point is that somebody, a customer, a happy customer would go and tell what 5 people maybe that they're happy, but an unhappy customer would tell 20 that they're unhappy.
Oh yeah.
And so the issue there is that they were concerned, and they had instances where customers had complained and it was causing them problems. They wanted those vehicles excluded, and they sought to have them excluded in their entirety. But what ended up happening was that the House Means and Ways Committee in Congress decided to allow an exemption for antique vehicles, ones that they deemed to be over 25 years old. Now, it didn't specify model year. It didn't specify anything in terms of time. It just, under the law, says 25 years old. That gives an agency like NHTSA a license to decide how it wishes to interpret that law. And so they've taken a very strict approach to it, which is to say that the vehicle had to be 25 years to the day old in order to be eligible for U.S. import. So that meant that you, as the importer, somebody purchases a vehicle overseas, if you want to bring it to the U.S., you have to know exactly what day it rolled off the assembly line. Otherwise, you're potentially subjecting that vehicle to seizure once it arrives here because you may not know exactly what day it was built. I did not personally feel that was what Congress intended. In looking through the regulatory history on the issue and the documentation, the congressional documents, what I found is that it was presented to Congress that the definition of year, including model years applied to vehicle, actually included basically a 2-year period, or even as much as 3 years. But basically, you could have a vehicle that was either side of the given model year actually be a model year. So you could have a vehicle that was built in 1984 as a 1985 model, and it's still a 1985. You could also have a vehicle built as a 1986 that was a 1985 model. So you could have it either side. And this was the definition that was understood by Congress at the time that they enacted the law. Moving forward, once the judge got to the portion where he was willing to hear the issue regarding the inspection of the vehicles, which I had been asking and requesting this whole time, the judge finally came around and said the issue and said, we agree with Mr. Hedrick. He has a right to inspect the vehicle. So we're going to give you guys a week or two. I can't remember the exact amount of time. We're basically going to give you a week or two to figure out how you're going to handle this. And then we'll go from there. And basically past that point, once we decided it, I had a year to figure it out. Now understand, the government was paying the check for everything up to this point. So they had been paying for storage, et cetera. And they were potentially looking at having to transport the vehicles to North Carolina. And one of the tactics they teach you in law school is in the process of litigation, what you want to do is you want to make it as expensive as possible to make it as unpalatable for them. And that's what I strove to do. And once we got to that point, once the judge issued that order, the next day I got an email from the AUSA requesting to come in for basically a mediation for a magistrate judge. And so we could work out to resolve the issue. At that point, I've been working on the case for about 8 months, and 6 months into the case, I was working full time for the state of North Carolina prior to that, but 6 months in, after speaking to my wife and receiving encouragement from her, I left my job with the state to work on that case pro bono full time until I got it resolved. She said that she just felt something good was going to come out of it, and it just ended up being something good was come out of it. And
That is the definition of a leap of faith.
Yeah. And so it did. And we went to mediation 1 week in North Carolina, and I couldn't script this. If I were going to write a movie, this is a twist that I just wouldn't have seen coming. But so I'm there. One of my clients is with me. Her name is Jennifer. And we're there in mediation with the judge. And then the government attorney is actually in another room. So they have us all separated out. The judge is going back and forth. And the judge came in, and again, a magistrate judge, not the judge who was overseeing the case, but the one who was mediating. And basically plopped down in her chairs like, okay, so what's the deal? What's the issue? And I started to talk, and I was being very legal about it and the way I approached it. He just was not having it for whatever reason. And my client, Jennifer, started to talk, and she made it very personalized for her because she and her family had been to Africa. That was their inspiration for wanting to get the vehicle, that it, to them, reminded them of the time that they spent in Botswana, and that it was very emotional for them. And that was the first instance that I saw the judge, the light shine through. And from that point, I just stopped talking because there wasn't really anything else for me to say. And the judge at that point opened up that he, when he was learning to drive, had learned to drive in a Series 3 Land Rover in central North Carolina. And subsequently, he and his father had driven up to Washington, D.C. to buy a second Land Rover that they ended up driving back to North Carolina. And I was like, I was dumbfounded at the time.
Take it, definitely.
I could not believe it. And at that point, he was like, okay, I think I got a good idea what's going on here. And he got up, he's like, let me go talk to them and I'll be back. And at that point in time, I knew right then and then it was over. Like, he hadn't even come back. And I was like, this is miraculous. And sure enough, he came back less than an hour later. We had a deal ironed out. The only remaining issue that we had was the cost of any damages that had occurred to any of the vehicles. Luckily, most of them hadn't sustained any damage, but there was one in particular that I knew, having seen photos of it, that it had been maimed horribly.
This is the one that was snapped in half with the wiring harness wrapped around the drive shaft?
That's a different one. That one, this is one that was collected as a pile of parts. It was in the process of being restored. And the government contractor responsible for picking it up, took it and bound everything with metal lashing.
Oh dear.
And then hooked a winch to it and towed it, dragged it across the ground onto the rollback, and then set it out in a field in Texas for a year.
Because it was just scrap metal to them.
Exactly. He told it, and they told the owner that you're not going to get this back. It's just scrap metal. And drove off that way. They ended up having to cut a very sizable check to the owner. Well, I dare say that they'd make that same mistake again, because we were able to share the damage that had been caused and get him made whole. There's a funny story that goes with that, because that client actually had to go down to Texas to receive the inspection. This was well after the case had been settled. When we got it resolved and he was getting the money for the parts, which he generally spent on replacement parts, it's just going to take me forever to get it back together. And this was July. And I was like, I bet you can't get it back together before Thanksgiving. And that I did that, knowing that was the fire that was going to be lit, right? So
Yeah.
I did it intentionally.
Gauntlet being thrown.
And I'll be damned. He had it done by Thanksgiving. And it was fully put together, and he painted it himself.
Wow.
It was I was just tickled, and I didn't care that I lost the bet. It was totally worth it.
What was the agreement then? How many Rovers were saved? Because wasn't one of them crushed already?
So there's a video that's online that CBP posted that had been from about a year prior to the vehicle.
So that was unrelated. That was more of a scare tactic, I take it.
Oh yeah, that smug guy talking about how he's keeping the country safe from all these dangerous old trucks.
Yeah, so that's an interesting, and I do know a little bit of the history. I wasn't personally involved in that one, but I do know how it arrived at the point that it ultimately was destroyed. So the story behind that vehicle, and again, looking at the photographs, I can't say that it was not the proper course of action, but I don't believe personally that it was the vehicle that it was claimed to be. That being said, I never got to inspect it myself, so I can't say for sure. But basically, that vehicle had been sought to be imported into the U.S. not once, not twice, but 3 or 4 different times. It got sent back to the U.K., and the then owner, was given the option to send it back. And my understanding is, in that 3 or 4 different times, that it had been resold to different people as being U.S. importable. And so it was different people who kept bringing it back in. And it arrived and it had been in storage, and they'd been, going back and forth over it for a while. He just decided, just keep it, and I'm not gonna deal with this. And then the government at that point in time decided, because it had been attempted to be imported so many times, and they were abandoning it, they would just go ahead and crush it and do the videos. They not only did that with that, but there's a video of a Mini too. Both are on my website. I have them linked to, but you can see a Mini that's being crushed. And there was a joint task force operation that was going on between the UK police and US Customs, where they were trying to track stolen vehicles. And that is an issue I do see that's still prevalent. The number of stolen vehicles that are not necessarily coming over as whole vehicles, but that are coming over as parts. And if you're somebody who's looking to buy parts from overseas, there absolutely is no guarantee that the parts that you're buying are actually legitimate, and especially coming out of the UK, because used parts, vehicles are getting stolen quite regularly over there. And it's just something you have to be mindful of.
So back to the agreement then, what was the resulting agreement from the case?
The agreement we reached with the U.S. Attorney's Office, one of the things that had the judge had asked me to do going into mediation was provide an accounting of the time that I had spent and the costs for it. I had been keeping track of it, but I hadn't really added it all up. And so
Perhaps because you didn't want to know.
I wasn't necessarily that. I never, getting paid was never part of what I was looking for. I didn't expect to be paid, but it didn't mean that I wasn't keeping track of the time. When I sat down and added it up and put the dollar figure to it, it ended up coming out at around $500,000 in legal fees.
Wow.
So the agreement was, because at that point in time, given that we were in settlement, I would have been entitled to legal fees. And part of the agreement was that I would forego that, which I was fine with doing, because again, it was never about that for me. It was about doing the right thing and getting vehicles returned. I did that, but we did allow a provision basically that for any damage sustained to the vehicles, I believe it was over $2,500 or $3,500. It was one of the two. I can't remember exactly. But any damage that was sustained in excess of that amount, the government would then reimburse the owner. And again, I had in mind at that time was one particular client who was going to need to be reimbursed. And there was another as well, but there ended up being other extenuating circumstances with that one. And his vehicle wasn't seized as a whole vehicle. It was actually also in the state of big restoration. The one thing I'm stressed about this case in particular, was there were a number of those vehicles that were sold as good running driving vehicles and they were not.
Yeah.
They were junk. They were not very good vehicles in terms of structural rigidity. In addition to that civil case, after I settled the civil case, there were vehicles that had been seized from the importer in Wilmington. They had a shop there, or a building, and there were several independent owners' vehicles that had their vehicles seized while they were at the shop there in Wilmington, and they were all pending as part of the criminal case. So once I got done with the civil case, I then took up the criminal case issue and went to get those clients' vehicles back. And there was nothing I could do about the criminal case so long as the civil case was pending. So that was another 6 months or so before I was able to get that fully resolved. And most of the vehicles in that instance had been taken up to Virginia Beach, where they were being stored. And so I was able to get them released. Most of the clients were able to meet me. There was one client in particular that I actually picked up his vehicle for him and then dropped it to a local Rover guy who was able to hold it for him until he was able to get down to collect it. But yeah, all in all, an ordeal. In the meantime, the automotive media had picked up all of this, and my phone just started ringing and hasn't stopped, to be quite frank. So I still get calls almost daily. I'm just me, so I don't have a staff. I work primarily from a home office. I have traveled, quite a bit for work. But yeah, it's at times more than I'm able to keep up with or respond to. So it's just keeps me on the go. I have at times tried to have people working with me, but I haven't had a lot of work. I'm getting that to work the way that I needed to. Again, being an attorney, I have certain requirements and have to be as far as maintaining confidentiality and control of records, et cetera. And when you have people that are working with you remotely, it becomes a little bit more difficult to maintain that structure. And also, I like being small and boutique, so it's not a bad gig. So I'm able to some degree pick and choose what I want, but I do have a difficult time in certain instances saying no when somebody needs help.
Has this become like your life's work now? Or are you helping Land Rovers or any vehicle now that has some sort of importation problem?
Yeah, I've worked with several different other types of importers and owners as well too. There have been issues recently with they call K or key trucks, Japanese mini trucks. I've worked with several owners, importers with those. Nissan Skylines or actually other Japanese imports. I've worked with those for a number of years. And here I also assisted people with importing vehicles. And I still offer that as something I do through my website. But to be quite honest, the casework has gotten to a point now where it's made it very difficult for me to assist in that context. I still would like to be able to do it, but I think I'm going to have to find somebody to partner with in order to work, better, to be able to better assist people in that particular. But I've imported from all over the world, some unusual military vehicles, tanks. I've done those as well too. Yeah, it's just an assortment. Vehicles I've shipped from Africa, Australia, Japan, Europe, pretty much the globe over.
We're 10 years after the big case, and it seems like Rovers are still being seized. What's up with that?
Yeah, unfortunately, they are still being seized. I've got just about a dozen vehicles that are currently seized out of Florida that I'm still representing, and I've been contacted about others, but Florida is one of the more problematic areas that I've had as of recent. I also work as an advisor for some new vehicle manufacturers, et cetera, but that's a whole other thing. But yes, Rovers down in Florida, and again, some of it is miscommunication. Some of them have issues that I'm working to address, at least as best I can. And knock on wood, I've never lost a client's vehicle per se, and I represent the same to my clients. But in some cases, they may not be allowed into the U.S. Maybe an issue where they're required to be exported if it's a non-conforming vehicle. But again, issue that I see most often is the novice buyers who just don't know what they're buying or what they're getting into. And it becomes problematic because, again, if they don't know exactly what they have, then if the vehicle arrives here and there is an issue with it, that leaves very little recourse. It's much easier to address problems before they become a problem than to address it once it becomes a problem. I'm a huge advocate for doing pre-purchase inspections, but that's with a qualification that you have somebody doing it that you trust, and B, knows what they're looking at, because you don't want to send somebody out who's not familiar with the vehicles to tell you exactly whether it's conforming or not, or whether it meets the standard or not. But you need to be able to verify information, and you may not be able to verify all of the component serial numbers. There's the capability to do that, but it's tedious. But there's certain basic things that a vehicle has to have in order to even meet that basic threshold requirement for being eligible for import. And in the case of every vehicle, that base thing has to have its original chassis. It cannot have a replacement chassis whatsoever. If a vehicle's coming from the EU or the UK and it has a galvanized chassis underneath it, understand that is a red flag. That'll get the vehicle stopped. And it, in most every instance, is not going to be U.S. eligible for import. Coming from other locations where galvanized chassis were the norm or the standard for installation from a time of original manufacturer, it's different. So like
South Africa.
Yeah, pre-19 or mid-1990s, South African, there's a company called Associated Automotive Distributors who was the licensed assembler in South Africa for what was then Leland or British Leland. So they actually, when the kits came in, complete knockdown or CKD kits, they would take the chassis and they would actually just drop them down the other end of the road to Cape galvanizing, and they would galvanize the chassis before they undertook final assembly. Same is true in Australia. Parenti constructed vehicles. These are vehicles that were constructed for the Australian Defence Force. They have original galvanized chassis. That's the way that they were contracted to build them. And these chassis, when they're galvanized, as you all know, they last pretty much forever. It really takes, unless you ding them up really bad, off-roading or get involved in an accident, they'll just keep going. But as a result of what happened in the bid case, again, one of the things that U.S. Customs has gotten accustomed to seeing is when a vehicle has a galvanized chassis, it's usually, in U.S. Customs eyes, a very good indication that the vehicle is not original, at a minimum. at worst, it may mean the vehicle stolen.
Right.
Because it's a common way that thieves and other people that they'll use to basically mask or cover up what an actual underlying vehicle is. And I've been called in to do inspections and other matters. At one civil matter I was working on involving a vehicle that had been represented to be a 1984 vehicle, but upon close inspection actually was 2001, 2002 vehicle. And we're able to even actually use acids to eat through the galvanizing and actually get down to the underlying numbers and to show what it actually was. And I've been called, there's actually, believe it or not, more than one case that I've been called to do inspections and work on those. And depending on where you are, the state governments look at the vehicles differently. For instance, the state of Ohio doesn't recognize chassis changes that happen outside the state of Ohio. So if you have a vehicle that has a chassis change in North Carolina and it gets sold to Ohio, if Ohio sees that, they will seize the vehicle and they will destroy it.
Wow.
Wow.
Oh, did not
And,
know that. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. What about Pennsylvania? Just out of curiosity, maybe live here. Any ideas there?
I haven't had any experience or issues with that as far as Pennsylvania is concerned.
Which is
I mean,
interesting because Ohio does not do state inspections.
And they don't
Yeah.
do trailers and some other things, but
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can't answer specifically. It's been the last time I was up in Ohio for one of these cases, it's been a few years ago now, but I have worked in similar matters and different issues in other states as well, too. California has always been somewhat problematic depending on what issue you're talking about, but you have their version of the EPA, and then they also have their, which is called California Air Resources Board, or CARB. And they also have ARB, which is the Automotive Repair Bureau. And they each have their own set of standards which they follow. And I've tried to work with them before because, again, as it turned out, much to the state of California's chagrin, in their own statutes, I, as an attorney, am allowed to do vehicle VIN verifications as part of my job. And when I presented evidence of this to the California Air Resources Board, they said, no, you don't. And then I had to physically show them the statute that said, yes,
I can.
I do have this authority.
Yes.
And to which they had to relent. They couldn't address that. So it was acknowledged that I had the right to do this. And I've worked with them. I take kind of some exception to the way that they draft rules, and they're very good at moving the goalpost in California. So when I sought to address the issue, and one of the concerns that I have in the way that they have, basically what they call import vehicle emissions, is that it's more or less a monopoly in the way that it's been erected, and it's erected that way as a result of state law. But I suspect that given the right case and the right person, right vehicle, that can be challenged. But again, the issue is to what end, because my concern would be is if you were to pursue it in federal context, that's the type of case that could go all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. But if they change the law in the meantime, then the issue could just be made moot, and they have the right to change the law anytime that they want to. So it's really an issue of whether or not you want to take the time issue and the cost, because again, to pursue that kind of case would be very expensive and costly.
Tip I'm hearing here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is make sure it's an original truck. Just do a pre-inspection no matter what you're purchasing that you want to bring in. And I guess make sure it doesn't have a galvanized chassis.
Yeah, having a replacement engine isn't as big an issue as it used to be, so long as it's, again, the same type of engine. Now, a common issue I will see, especially as it pertains to 300 TDIs and some 200 TDIs, is that they do, when they say the same model engine, they mean that down to the engine serial number. So there are different variations of 300 TDI engines. Same for 200 TDI. So 200 TDI at 11L prefix engine is a Defender intended 200 TDI. And they also did a 12L 200 TDI, which is the version that was used in Discovery. And you'll quite commonly, a 12L is very similar to the way a 300 TDI is. There's actually very little difference between the two. But if you put a 12L as a replacement engine into a Defender that was originally fitted with an 11L engine, then that doesn't qualify for the exemption under the EPA code, or at least in the EPA's view. Again, you and I know that there's not very much difference, if any, in the engines, but they've taken a very strict approach to it once again. And that's something that you have to abide by, because otherwise you end up in this situation. Another thing to keep note of is the fact that the EPA's regulations and the NHTSA's regulations, they don't meet like this. So the rule for EPA for, again, yeah, it's a bureaucratic thing. The rule for the EPA is that a vehicle engine has to be more than 21 model years old or 21 years old. And they don't care about the day. They just, so long as it was built in one particular year, then it's exempt. For instance, my 110, my BMW, actually was able to import it under an approved special use permit from NHTSA as a demonstration vehicle for training that I've done with law enforcement agencies. But at the time, the vehicle was just over 21 years old, but under 25 years old. So it was exempt for EPA purposes, but not exempt for NHTSA's purposes.
The safety side.
On the federal motor vehicle, so not exempt from federal motor vehicle safety standards, but was able to, again, offer it based on EPA form as being exempt for purposes of its regulation, but it had to get special permission from NHTSA in order to bring it in. Actually, that reminds me, I've got a client that I represented a number of years ago, and I've actually assisted a few clients like this where they are coming to the U.S. not to import a vehicle, but as a temporary import. So they're training people who will come over and they want to do a tour around the U.S. for a year or maybe slightly less and bring their own vehicle. And I actually had a gentleman who came in from Australia who had a Jeep that had the Hemi conversion done to me. So what was remarkable about all this is that he actually had done everything himself, all the paperwork, and had been done correctly and had the correct, but the vehicle still ended up getting stopped at the port. And I had to go to fight with U.S. Customs to get it released and say, no, look, he's done everything proper. It is correct. You need to release it. And they ultimately did release it. But it happened for a period of time, and it caused some difficulty. And I have his permission to talk about this, so I'm not worried about it. But it was a unique set of circumstances. And I've had people that have come over with newer Defenders, again, European travelers, et cetera, where they'll bring vehicles into the U.S. And again, in that context, it's important for those importers or temporary importers to realize that there's a fair amount of latitude in what you can do, so long as you're doing the proper paperwork in advance. And you have to do all of it in advance. You can't just show up at the border and say, hey, I'm going to import it. That won't cut it.
I'm here with my Defender. Let me in. Yeah, let me fill out the paperwork right now. Yeah.
So you got to get the proper EPA approval in advance. You got to get the proper NHTSA approval in advance. And then you show up and you have the letters of approval in hand, and then you get those to U.S. Customs. But that's something that not everybody is aware of. But I've helped clients import show and display vehicles that are, again, coming in underneath temporary imports. I've been a consultant on some articles that have been written by the automotive media regarding such things. It's been interesting. It's apparent to me a steady flow of vehicles that come into the U.S. that shouldn't be here, and not necessarily Land Rovers, but all types of vehicles. From what I can see, U.S. Customs isn't able to police everything. It's just because of the sheer volume of it that's coming in. And I think that if you look at statistically, it's somewhere in the teens in terms of percentage of what they actually have the manpower to carry out inspections on. And that's for everything. The amount of cargo that comes into any given U.S. port on a day, it's quite staggering.
On that note, something that I got the sense of back during the big case was that these vehicles are coming in through multiple different ports, and it seems like each field office had a different way of processing the paperwork. And I think that's maybe where some of the problems happen, because like in the case of all the trucks that were seized, a lot of those, the declaration forms, he correctly declared when they were short of the 25 years, and Customs rubber stamped it and said, okay, it's cool, bring it in anyway. And then they came in later and said no. And it just seems like it's one office doing one thing and another office interpreting it a different sort of way. Has that improved any?
No, not really. There's still a lot of inconsistency from port to port and the way things are handled to carry it out. I had an issue most recently, and then by recently, within the last few months, 6 months or so, where I regularly conduct port inspections. I can go to just about any port in the U.S. and conduct a port inspection, with the apparent exception of the port of Miami. The assistant port director, and we're on a first name basis, but he's a nice guy, but he does not want to allow me to do a port inspection at his port while the vehicle hasn't cleared customs. Basically, in essence, have had to wait for the vehicle to be formally seized, and now I can conduct an inspection of it. But it's a bit aggravating because, again, if it's possible for me to address an issue before seizure takes place, then it saves headaches all around. But
I would think it saves money too.
yeah, but they're used to doing things a certain way, and it's very difficult. So I've had some success. So don't get me wrong. There was a point where if a vehicle was denied entry or seized based on something that was deemed to be non-conforming, the only recourse or the only available action was to export the vehicle, fix the issue, and then you could attempt to re-import it, or you could submit it for import again. But in order to do that, it had to be exported from the country. I've actually had success now with the time that I've been doing this and with the people that I've been working with on U.S. Customs side, that I've been able to facilitate getting such things done without the vehicle having to be exported. In some contexts, I can come in and perform manipulations, what they deem it to be. I've had vehicles where non-conforming parts were installed, and in that instance was able simply to go in and remove the non-conforming parts and either surrender them or destroy them, depending on what the circumstances are. But that's something you have to be mindful of too, especially when it comes to Land Rovers. So if you're going to replace a part on a car, certain parts of the vehicle are subject to federal motor vehicle safety standards if they're replacement parts, or they are replacement parts. These include things like exterior lighting, seat belts, brake lines, window glass. All of these things are subject to federal motor vehicle safety standards. And so there are certain things that the average person doesn't necessarily think about, but like a windscreen glass has to be certified as being AS1. That means no tint whatsoever. And it's not uncommon to find one that has AS2, which is a slight tint to it. That doesn't qualify. That's non-conforming. And that can be a reason for the vehicle to be stopped and or seized at the port of entry. And so it's just not something that you want to mess with. These standards, they're not consistent throughout the whole vehicle. AS1 for windshield, AS1 or 2 for the doors, driver passenger windows. And then you can be AS1, 2, or 3 from the second row passenger's back. But you have to meet that standard. Each of these things has to have a certification. Wheels and tires are also subject to federal motor vehicle safety standards. So they have to have the proper certification stamped on them. Usually it's going to be a DOT letter and some upport date stamp codes for tires, etc. Wheels even.
Steering wheel. It's a question for you, since I take it that the side of the vehicle that steering wheel's on, that's not considered a safety issue, obviously, because
That's not a replacement part. It's exempt.
So that's a trick question. So when it comes to sidedness of the vehicle, whether it was built as a right-hand drive or a left-hand drive, for purposes of import, it has to be as it was when it was originally manufactured.
okay.
So no offshore left-hand drive conversions then.
So if the VIN number reflects a right-hand drive vehicle, when it's presented for import to the U.S., it has to be a right-hand drive vehicle. A left-hand drive vehicle is considered, if it's been restored that way, it is considered in DOT or at least TSA's eyes to be a newly manufactured vehicle.
Interesting.
And that's where the issues really start with that, because if what you don't want to be considered is a vehicle manufacturer, or for the vehicle to be considered a newly manufactured vehicle, because then what that does, it bumps up the regulatory requirement all the way to current day. So that means
Which
the vehicle
also means crash testing, right?
corrects all of the whole thing. Everything, every other vehicle, new vehicle has to qualify or have an order to be imported. It has to have as well too. So think back, for instance, to the whole VW diesel scandal. cheating scandal. If you make each one of these declaration forms, EPA forms, these declarations are subject basically to the same level of truthfulness that you would be required to make in court. And therefore, if you lie in open court, you're subject to perjury, which is a felony. Same thing is true on these declaration forms. You're subject to the exact same level of scrutiny and requirements. When the VW diesel thing happened, one of the VW executives just happened to be flying into Miami with his family on vacation, and he got arrested at the airport on those charges for false certification, and it was held on those charges for trial. So it's no small thing. Now, obviously, that was a much bigger scale than we're talking about an individual Land Rover, but again, the same penalty is applicable, whether it's one or 2,000, whatever. It's quite substantial. So it's not something you want to mess with. And it's why it's that much more important to make sure what you're buying and what you're presenting for import. Because in most cases, you're lucky, if U.S. Customs just seeks to, seize or forfeit your property, because they could, in theory, go after you in a criminal aspect for false certifications, et cetera. And that's kind of something that you want to deal with.
Assuming it's your name on the form.
Correct. Assuming it's your name on the form. And there are importers out there that can handle imports for other people as well, too. I'm not one of those. In terms of what I did, I help people to fill out the forms correctly. And in some cases, I just prepare the forms for them, review them, and then provided to them for signature for filing with U.S. Customs. But I had a dedicated broker that I worked with that, again, I trusted him to do everything as I would do it myself. And we still have an ongoing relationship in that regard. And anytime I have an issue or something is presented with one of the client's vehicles, I refer to him to review, to let me know what's missing, what needs to be corrected, et cetera.
So knowing what you now know, how would the knockdown kit have gone for Land Rover back in the day? Because I know that there are some exemptions for kit cars, and there's some extra rules for things like that.
So it's actually a little known fact, and this will probably blow some minds when I share this. So 1997 was the year that made airbags a requirement for all passenger vehicles. What if I told you that Land Rover could have continued to sell Defender in the U.S. past 1997 and did not have airbags?
Limited quantity or the kit?
Knockdown kit, right?
Specific model.
Don't change the model name. Don't change the model name number.
So you have to think like a truck. Understand that, again, the airbag requirement was applicable to passenger vehicles. So if you jumped up to the 2500 and 3500 series pickup trucks, that requirement hadn't taken effect as of that date.
So build a 130 with a big GVW on it, and you don't have to put an airbag in.
But would it have been subject to the 25% import tax on pickups?
It would have been,
but they still could have made it
right
point and brought and imported it.
So they could have continued to import Defender 130 as a conforming vehicle. There actually is another way they could have gotten around the 25% duty, although I'd have to go back and check because I'm not sure whether it was existence at that time. But there is a provision within the harmonized tariff schedule which allows for what is called a chassis cab. And Toyota took advantage of this for a number of years, and this is how they imported pickup trucks from Japan in the 80s, where they shipped them with just the cab only. And so
that's how Rover was doing it in Australia as well, shipping them in as chassis.
And then they would install the beds here in the U.S. And that's only 4% duty instead of 25%. So it's not the 2.5% duty on passenger vehicles, but it's still substantially lower. Or as I've done some, or assisted clients to do some tariff engineering in this regard as well too. It is later actually did build 127s and 130s that had bench seats in the bed. And in that sense, if it was manufactured as a passenger vehicle by Land Rover, usually they went through special vehicles division for these upfits, but they were used for mining, et cetera. But that vehicle is a genuine passenger vehicle. And so as such, it's only subject to the 2.5% duty rate instead of the the higher tariff rate as a commercial vehicle.
And that you're saying that includes the sideways bench seats.
Yeah. Customs will get picky with it now, because I want to see documentation as far as proof that it meets the criteria. But I can tell you in practice, I've got records where Land Rover has done this or assembled vehicles this way. It is possible to do that. There's case law out there that drills down to the heart of this issue, and I've gone ringing around with customs on some of these. Yeah, who remembers the Isuzu Amiga? And
Hey, what's an SUV? Yes. What's a car? What's a truck? Yeah, I remember that.
So there was a case that came up, and the Pathfinder was very similar, but basically customs was basically on the Amiga because they wanted to classify it as a commercial vehicle based on the way that it was built. It said it was more intended for carrying cargo than it was for carrying passengers, and that the argument was made contrary by the original manufacturer. So they went to court, and it was a good bit of case law on it, and the judge ultimately decided that the vehicle was a passenger vehicle. And he set out the criteria for determining what is a passenger vehicle versus a commercial vehicle. That same criteria has since been applied to pre-owned or used commercial Land Rovers that are being imported to the U.S. If you look at that, I'm sure you've likely heard stories from people who had their tariff rates moved up or adjusted by U.S. Customs when they submitted as a passenger vehicle, and they ended up getting hit with a 25% later down the road. Right. And Customs actually is allowed to do that within a certain period of time. The reason for that is because they want to look at the VIN, because the VIN indicates how the vehicle was originally manufactured. And they're going to go based off of that initially. And then they're going to look at some additional criteria and other factors involved. For instance, the fact that a vehicle, if it wasn't built as a genuine station wagon, there is a way to determine. So I have a yellow Defender 90 that was built as a genuine station wagon. This factor doesn't play in, and it's just considered to be a station wagon. But for a vehicle that wasn't built as a genuine station wagon, it's the fact that it has a bulkhead behind the front driver passenger seat. That is intended to be a separation between the driver and cargo. And that's the way it's viewed by Customs. So that could be a 110, that could be a 90, depending
Series
on how
3,
it's set up.
A Series 3 109.
Yep. So again, if it doesn't have carpet back there, so there are what they call cross rulings. The Customs has these rulings where people submit to Customs for determination. Now, later we actually did this with Defender back in the 1990s when they were importing them to the U.S. as brand new, and they submitted North American spec 94 to Customs and gave it up for inspection because they wanted Customs to determine that the vehicle was a passenger vehicle and not a commercial vehicle. Because again, you have to think back on what the early 94 Defenders were. The early 94 NAS Defenders, they were considered passenger vehicles because they only had 2 seats and they didn't have a full roll cage. He only had, so that back load area, it was generally considered to be a convertible, not a truck, based on the way that it was configured. And again, I made this argument with U.S. Customs over and over again. Roll cages are intended to protect people, not stuff. We don't care about stuff getting messed up, or at least not as much, but we do care about protecting lives. Again, the roll cage is over the front. As you go back, you look at where the roll cage is installed. If it's got a roll cage, that's a good indication that vehicle was set up to protect passengers. The elimination of the rear bulkhead is also a step in the right direction towards consideration of the passenger vehicle. The court in that case involving the Isuzu also said that the fact that the carpet came up over the wheel wells, etc., that these are alteration and permanent seatbelts. The fact that it had permanent seatbelts in the rear area, that all lent to the representation and understanding that the vehicle was intended for the purpose of transporting passengers. And less so. Now, it could transport goods, but then the court basically went on to say that you have to look at it, is it more intended for this than that? And again, because of these additional items, it's more intended to passengers than it is, intended to transport goods. Not to say that it couldn't transport goods, but it's then equipped to do this. Ford had a kind of reverse issue of this with regard to these transit vans that at one time, or actually still, they build in Turkey, where they were shipping them in with glass side windows and rear bench seats, rear passenger seats, so that they were seeking to get that classification as passenger vehicles. Then when the vans hit the port, they'd rip all that stuff out, put them in containers and send them back to Turkey. And Customs said, no, you can't. These are going to be considered commercial vehicles. So they went through a whole process of that. So it's interesting to see the way it goes back. And tariff engineering is a real thing.
If I remember correctly, that Isuzu case also brought about the end of the two-door SUV for similar reasons. I think they all went to making four doors because it made it easier to declare it as a passenger vehicle.
Yeah, and I could see the merit in that. I don't know. I think that the way that the market trended, if you looked even at the traditional Jeep Wrangler, the four-door outsells the two-door, I think 3 or 4 to 1, to the point that they talked about just completely discontinuing the two-door Wrangler altogether, which I think would be a shame. I think that they just look at it from a marketing and sales standpoint. I don't know that it necessarily had to do with, it may have, but I can see that the argument could be made. I had to talk with one of the execs who worked in one of those companies at the time, read one of the articles. Yeah, it's quite possible.
It was a pretty marked shift in industry wide in terms of at least the import SUVs around that period. Like
I'm speaking specifically to the Japanese.
Right. Yeah.
So everybody remembers the Subaru Brat.
Oh yeah.
Which came with seats in the back
with gunner handles.
Mm-hmm. That was tariff engineering by Subaru in order to get the vehicle qualified as a passenger vehicle. Yeah. Again, it exists. It still goes on to some degree today. One of the big things that I see is it comes up every so often where we talk about the chicken tax and as it applies to pickup trucks or commercial vehicles. But the chicken tax didn't really start out necessarily as what we know it as today. We think it primarily involving the trucks, but we know it is really a significance behind the name. But it had to do with American chicken that was being exported, and not to we weren't exporting sort of like live chickens, but frozen chicken. In the 1960s or late 1960s, we made some significant advancements in refrigeration and frozen goods, and to the point that we were exporting more frozen chicken to countries, and we were in essence in places like Germany putting their local chicken farmers out of business. And so they, in Germany and other places, decided that they were going to levy hefty tariffs on American chicken to bolster its in-country chicken industry. Ours, you can imagine, the American farmers weren't very happy about this, and they complained to their congressmen, senators, etc. And so certain targeted tariffs were placed on goods coming from those countries as like a retaliation. And it didn't include just pickup trucks. It included things like dextrose. But as time has gone on, the chicken tax has pretty much subsided with regard to all the other things that were on that list initially, with pretty much the exception of the pickup trucks or light duty trucks and vans. And the reason for that is significant lobbying by the big 3 American automotive manufacturers to keep it in place, because it gave them, for a long time, a protected truck market where outside, manufacturers or foreign manufacturers couldn't compete with them in this market.
And that's why Toyota and Honda have plants now here in the U.S. building trucks.
And Nissan
And so, and of course, begs the question, now that all exists, is there really a need for that law to still be in place, given the amount of production that is now taking place in the U.S.?
Right.
And they've talked, and it comes up every so often, the idea that you just go ahead and get rid of it. But the big 3 manufacturers want to keep it in place.
Oh, no, they want to keep their
trucks are big business.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
best-selling vehicle in America for 4,000 years running, the Ford F-150.
Yeah, it hasn't gone away. I don't expect it to go away anytime soon. There's not really any big push for it to do so. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where things go through, especially with the electric vehicles. I think that the next several years are going to be some very interesting ones in the automotive industry.
We've talked a lot about the legal aspects, and this all comes from the big case that was 10 years ago, and in fact started 10 years ago today that we're recording this. As an interesting side note, if you will, once this was all done and people had their trucks back, your clients all got together and they pitched in and they bought you a 110 for your collection. And I think that's just the ultimate karma.
I could not have been more surprised. I was not expecting it. I didn't know anything about it. Jennifer, one of my clients, had reached out to my wife, Jessica, and asked her if it would be okay. Jessica responded, yeah, sure. I feel, what is it, in Christmas Vacation where Chevy Chasing, if I woke up tomorrow and my head's into the carpet, I wouldn't be more surprised than I am right now when Cousin Eddie shows up with the driver.
Which means they must have gotten somebody else to import it so that you wouldn't know about it.
Yeah, so there was a whole drawn out drama that followed that vehicle. And so the vehicle in my garage now is actually not the same 110. And I'll segue, so, or at least as best I can. They got together and they threw a huge party here in North Carolina in July. So that would have been 9 years ago. And most of the clients came to the party. So it was a big deal. And we went up and everybody spent the night where we were. And so at one point in time, they got up on stage and said, "All right, by the way, here you go." And my jaw hit the floor and I couldn't believe it. And it was a white 110 station wagon from France. I actually still have the number plate off the front of it. It hangs on the wall in my garage. And I just was tickled. And the truck had lived a long, good life. It was a left-hand drive truck and a late 80s model. And it just, I could not, just over the moon. And so I drove it. We were over in Statesville, and I drove it back to Raleigh, where I am. I was actually driving it over to our family's farm the day following. And then all of a sudden, just black smoke out of the back.
Oh, dear.
And the vehicle was originally fitted with the 19J turbo diesel engine. They are notorious for having engine issues.
Yes.
And
infamous.
And so what had happened was this one is that the block had cracked just straight through, and there was nothing that I could do about it. So I was
worried you're going to say that CBP showed up and seized the truck and
wouldn't that be irony?
So I was hopeful at first that wasn't the case, but it just absolutely was, and there was nothing that could be done. I didn't even know how doors start, because I couldn't be ungrateful. I was just going to have to fix it. At least that's what I was expecting to have to do. However,
they wanted to give you not just the truck, but the joy of the project.
Of real Rover ownership.
So I didn't really say anything to anybody except for maybe one or two people who knew. And a few days later, it actually was a company in the UK, the gentleman who runs that company contacted me and said, "I heard about what happened. We'd like to offer to take the truck back and give the money back." And I was like, and I was blown away by that. I didn't know what to say. To me, I was concerned that it would be, insulting to the clients if I gave the vehicle back, and I didn't know what to do. I reached out to the client who had organized it, and I spoke with her and said, "They've made this offer. I'm not sure what to do." She goes, "We didn't intend to give you a problem. We intended for you to get a truck and that you could drive and enjoy it." I said, "I don't want the money." I was like, "I don't want the money to come to me." So I said, "If we're going to do this, what I want to do is I want the money to go to you to hold until we find a truck to replace it with." And that to me, that's what I would like to see happen if that's what we're going to do. And she was fine with that. So that's what happened. Now, getting the money returned, there was a third party involved. And I'm not going to jump into all that because it's a big mess. But
just skip ahead. Yes.
Yeah.
Get to the good part.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at any rate, we ultimately got the money back, but looking at trucks, and I had seen one of these BMW engine Defenders. I've read about them like years before, but never actually seen one in person. But like in a magazine, I'd seen it. And it never, ever crossed my mind that it actually owned one. And was looking on the internet as you do. And I saw this one, and it was a good price. Not only was it a good price, it was half the price of the one that they had given me. And it was in South Africa. And I sent it to the client. I was like, what do you think of this one? And she's, I love it. And I said, I like it a lot too, but it wasn't old enough at the time. So we contacted the owner, got in discussions, and basically I made up my mind that what I was going to do is just going to keep it in Africa and have an excuse to go. Because in my mind, it made sense. And I would just keep it there until put it in storage and keep it there until it was old enough to come into the U.S. And so I just went ahead and bought it underneath that plan. I'd come to find out, though, in South Africa, you can't get the registration issued in your name unless you're going to be a resident in South Africa and work for more than 6 months. So my plan fell apart from there. However, troubleshot it fairly quickly and was able to do some research and was able to sort out a way that I was able to ship it to Canada. And as somebody who is somebody who's not a Canadian citizen who vacations in Canada, you are permitted under Canadian law to keep a vehicle in Canada.
And their rule is 15 years for importation.
And their rule is 15 years. So the vehicle was 15 years old, or over 15 years old at the time. So I made arrangements to ship. And actually, if my brother also had a Camel Trophy, a genuine Camel Trophy 110 that also happened to be in South Africa at the same time. And so I made arrangements to ship them both to Canada. And his vehicle was older than mine, but they were able to ship them together. And then I met them both at the port in Canada, unloaded them, and then moved them to storage, where they stayed for, only for a couple of months, and then mine for the next several. I'll actually say several for the next couple of years until it became eligible for U.S. import. And the first event I took it to was Winter Raw, which was a lot of fun. Yep. I took my youngest daughter with me. We had a great time.
Nice. Yes. How many times have you been to the romp?
Only the once. Yeah. It's a long drive from North Carolina.
Did you hear the sad news just released?
Yeah.
We're recording today. Big G's is closed permanently. The place with the big sandwiches. Yeah.
Bruce, that's going to change the romp.
Yep. I remember that place fondly.
Yes.
There's some good food.
Good food. It was a great place to meet in the morning. Yeah. You get breakfast, and then you get the big sandwich and take it with you.
So now you're gonna have to buy lunch more than once for the whole weekend.
That's right. Yes. Or figure out a way to feed your family of 4 in a different way.
Yeah. Winter Romp was great. I really enjoyed that event.
And what other activities have you participated in or taken the truck to? Did you name this Defender the i6 BMW engine?
I think I'm going to give part credit to one of my clients, Chris, who he went with me to Canada to visit the truck. So actually one of the humor stories behind that is explaining to the Canadian customs officer why I'm coming to Canada. And I said, well, I'm going to visit my truck. And he just looks at me with this really confused expression on his face. I was like, no, I'm serious. And I tell him the whole story. He's okay. All right, well, have fun.
Move
and
along.
It just sends you on your way.
Right.
But one of my clients rode with me. His name's Chris. And we were talking about, because he felt very strongly the truck should have a name too. And the clients, I have a habit, or at least in that case, I had a habit of quoting Winston Churchill a lot, just to keep research, a lot of for quotes, whatnot. And it turned out, if you know anything about it, Churchill's wife's name was Clementine. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, that's the name that stuck. The 110's name is Clementine.
Oh, excellent.
Everybody thinks it's named for the song. It's not. It's named for Winston Churchill's wife. But and me being a little bit of a nerd and a legal nerd, the other reason I like that is because that the root word or the Latin root is clemens, which is the same for clemency, which I thought was very fitting given the truck's significance.
Yes. And has Clementine been to other rallies, activities? You've taken it on any long trips or journeys, overlanding?
She is a little bit spoiled. I haven't gotten her wet, except I think maybe once or twice. She spends a lot of time in the garage. She has been to Old North State Land Rover Society event, and I think a Carolina River Owners Club event. I would like to take her to an event further away. It's on my list to load up the family and do a trip out to Colorado and Utah. But it's just a matter of when that'll happen. But otherwise, I could pick up a drive down the coast if I wanted to. I just haven't done it yet. I also have another Defender in the driveway, which was my UK runabout, whose name is Toby. Toby gets his name from his number plate, which ends in the letters TOB.
And what exactly is Toby? A D90? D10?
Yeah, Toby is a 200 TDI station wagon, painted bright yellow, not double A yellow, not like the NAS trucks, but it's a British standard yellow, which is a color they use for a couple of different applications. So Toby's interesting because Toby records indicate he was built for internal stock at Land Rover. And it's possible that he may have been a factory-owned vehicle because the UK number plates that were issued are typical for this, or some of the typical ones that were issued for vehicles that were factory-owned. It's been indicated. So an interesting thing about it is, I'm sorry, I'm going to nerd out for a second. So he was built in...
Just for a second, not all night.
Yeah. So he was built in March of 91, but he's on a J registration plate. So built in March of 91, was dispatched from the factory for some purpose in August of 91. So he sat at the factory doing something or nothing for a period of time. But it didn't end up being registered until November of 91, which actually put it on a 92 model year plate. That's what they refer to as a J registration, because it has a J as the first character in the number plate. But he should have been an H registration because he'd been sitting around the factory for that long. What he was doing, I don't know. I have a suspicion that he may have been built for presentation to the RAF. So the RAF use these airport cars that are all painted the same color. It's required by their internal regulations. I have an idea that it may have been tested, or it may have been tested as an RAF vehicle and then returned and then went on to work as a British Telecom vehicle or whatnot. I'm not really sure. But it's interesting history. And the color, the exterior paint's not original, but the interior is all the same color because I pulled the headliner out and everything. Something that my British friends give me a lot of ribbing over because they don't understand why I pulled the headliner out. But they also don't live in North Carolina. So they've...
Yes.
It was they just don't have a need for it here. Yes. But I'm going to drive them both everywhere here in town. I can, for the amount that I drive, I can probably go a month in between filling up with diesel. Clementine, on the other hand, is very thirsty. She drinks a lot of petrol.
Yes. Yes.
So she's in miles, she's sub 100,000 miles. And so I'm just hating her a little bit. She gets a special treatment.
It's a thirsty one, but it's probably a fun drunk.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, she gets up and goes very quickly. So she holds the distinction of being the fastest production Land Defender ever built. If you were to get the icon,
even more than a Defender Works V8 that they came out with right before the end of the production.
So
depends on whether you consider that a production Rover or not.
So I'm gonna get a shout out to my good friend Greg K. Greg, if you're out there listening. So Greg and I go roundabout. So Greg actually was the engineer who worked on the Works V8 Defender design. So the Works V8 does not hold the distinction of being the fastest production Defender. However, it does hold the distinction of being the quickest. And at 0 to 60, the Works V8 will outrun my 2.8. But my 2.8 has a higher top speed. But the reason for it is not what you think. So they couldn't, because
limiter?
No, tires.
Huh. Interesting.
They couldn't get a certification from BF Goodrich for the 18-inch tires.
Good information.
But I do enjoy giving them a hard time about that.
Do you own any other Land Rovers? Those the only two?
I've owned several over the years. I only own two. I have in the past owned 3 NAS Defender 90s. I also owned a 99 Trek Discovery from Bodega Bay. I owned 2 regular Series 2 Discoveries. An LR3. I've owned 3 Range Rover Classics, one of which was actually just a parts car. And
it counts.
It's been fully parted out. It was used to salvage 2 others. But my classics I've actually since parted ways with, one of them was actually given to me by a member of the Arizona Land Rover Club. And the same trip that I went out to take the client's Defender out west and went to the auction and went to the 4x4 meet, I picked up that Range Rover and towed it back to North Carolina. It's actually since been passed on to another friend who's undertaking it as a restoration project. The problem is that I've got too many things on my hand to actually have. I also had a 1965 Jeep CJ5 that was given to me by the winner of a very dear friend of mine, who was like a grandfather to me. His name was Owen, but he bought the Jeep brand new in Long Beach, California, and I've torn it all the way down to the frame. I haven't had the time to pick it. He did a lot of custom modifications, and some of them are going to have to be undone in order to make it correct. But it's going to take some time to get that. And then we've got a couple Jeeps in the house. My oldest daughter has a JK, which we've done some upgrades to. And then I'm trying to think if I'm missing anything.
What do you consider your daily?
I drive Toby, the yellow Land Rover mostly. It's actually my son's favorite, so he likes going to school. The thing is, when you drive a yellow Land Rover around town, you can't go anywhere without people stopping and talking to you.
Yes.
And because it's hot here in North Carolina, especially in the summertime, I ride all with the windows down. You pull up to the stoplight, people want to talk to you.
Yes.
You pull up to the gas station, people want to talk to you. And it's like having a dog.
Drive a 130, you get the same thing.
I've been stuck in traffic and talking to the guy next to me. I remember Olaf and turns out he was from Europe, and I'm sitting in traffic on the Parkway here in Pittsburgh, and it's like, oh yeah, I had one of those. I drove this, and yes, we understand.
Yeah, so it's great, and yeah, it's actually super ecstatic because I've only made really 2 major modifications to both of the trucks, and that was the installation of Max 110 bumpers on both of them, which were a trick to find. Luckily, one of them was given to me by a friend of mine, and the other one I purchased locally from another friend of mine. They're both fitted up with those, and so I wasn't even sure that the one was going to fit the 90 at first, but it fits perfect because it has the points for it that are basically the same between 90 and 110 at that time.
Clementine and Toby, are they both automatic or are they stick?
They're both manuals. Toby is the LT77, and the times the R380. Clementine does have AC, but I rarely use it actually.
It's that little knee chiller that they put in the South African trucks, right?
Yeah, it doesn't have a very wide
It's
reach.
great for keeping your kneecaps cool, but the rest of you not so much.
Yeah, and primarily on the passenger side too, not so much on the driver's side. It doesn't seem like much of the cold air makes it over to my side of the vehicle when driving.
Proximity to the blower.
They're both fun to drive. Clementine mostly gets driven on nice days, and I'm actually going to put a new set of tires on her in the not too distant future. The tires on it now are ones that were installed, I think, in 2013. So they're not out of tread, but they're at the end of their usable life.
Clementine is the truck which bears the custom badge with the case number on it.
And Toby actually has his own custom badge with his own case number on it.
Ah.
Its case number is the Quarter International Trade case.
Oh, sure.
So that I settled. So that one, after we settled that case and they got the warrant officer's vehicle returned, his name's Chuck. That badge went on the Toby.
We've had a fantastic conversation. This will probably end up being one of the better episodes we've had in a long time. And want to thank you for coming on the podcast on this 10th anniversary of the big case where you defended defenders, you preserved defenders here in the United States. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
And thank you for everything you've done. And please keep on fighting the good fight to protect our right to have the rusty old trucks that we want.
I'll do the best I can.
We hope you enjoyed show number 136. Thanks to Will Hedrick, the defender of defenders. And we also need to thank his wife. I hope you enjoyed that conversation.
His wife is a saint.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And we hope to have Will back on in a future episode, future podcast to have part 2.
So many more questions to ask him. So many more stories we need to hear.
And thanks to Harold, Morgan, and Dixon, as always, joining us on the podcast. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, sure.
No problem. Yeah, thanks.
And the One True Pax for his continued production support. We do appreciate it, Pax. We post a new podcast at the end of every month. Our website, CentreSteer.com, has all our shows that you can listen to and show notes with the links of the stories we discussed in today's podcast, including Defenders and the Tunison Foundation that Dixon helps out with and volunteers with. You volunteer with Tunison, right?
Yes, I do. I write a lot of their material. I do their newsletter. It's a worthwhile venture. And I'll try not to go on the huge tangent, but you go to air shows and it's amazing how people really don't even really know what the Second World War was, which is sad.
Indeed.
Is Lassie going to Oshkosh this year?
Lassie is on her way to Oshkosh as we speak with Ben in the pilot seat.
And you're not going?
I've done it 2 years in a row and taking a break this year. I've just been away for 7 weeks to go and do another one is a bit much.
You need to stand on the ground for a while, apparently.
Oh, yes.
You can directly support the podcast at patreon.com/CentreSteer. You can buy a t-shirt, sticker, or buy us a tea/brownwater. Visit our website for all the details. If you have an idea for a guest, we're always open to guest ideas that are involved in the Land Rover community in some fashion. Send us the details and a contact info if you have it. Thank you for listening. We'd love to hear from you and what you're up to in your Land Rover.
On behalf of the entire crew here at the CentreSteer podcast, I'd like to thank you for listening today. We know you have a choice when it comes to your podcast content, and we do appreciate your choosing us. Please take a moment to look around you for any personal items you may be leaving behind, especially in the overhead bins. Remember, some items may have shifted during the show. Please watch your step as you make your way past the armed customs agents that have come for your truck, and you may now resume your important things.
I'm sorry, I'm going to nerd out for a second.